Lord of Mysteries, The Fool Brother is a Witch. By Tuozhang de Yizhe. Chapter 176-200. Will's Whereabouts. Famous opera singer Daisy Bevan announces retirement. Quote. Hypocritical lowland gentleman, innocent maiden dies tragically at home. Klein enjoyed his ice cream while silently reading the newspaper. There wasn't much ice cream, and Klein hadn't finished the first newspaper by the time he scooped out the last spoonful. He put down the spoon, folded the newspaper, and placed it back, saying, "I need to check on the detective agency." As it was a part-time job, Klein couldn't always sit in the detective agency, so he left a pen and paper at the door. Today was his first day of business, and he needed to check the effectiveness of the advertisement. Eve understood and cast an illusion on Klein, transforming him into the likeness of Sherlock Moriarty. Only after Klein left through the window did Eve stand up. She patted Ruirui's head, her palm hovering in midair to flatten the triangular cat ears, and said, "Put the cup and silver spoon in the kitchen." Ruirui spread her cat paws, pads facing up, displaying them to Eve, and leisurely said, "I'm just a cat, meow." Despite saying so, she still crouched down, tilted her head, picked up the cup with her mouth, and ran to the kitchen. Eve glanced at Ruirui's retreating figure, then retracted her gaze and turned to go up the stairs. As usual, she slowly returned to her room, locked the door, and went to her desk. From the mirror world, she took out the paper crane and a silver mirror. The mirror's surface was oval-shaped, with intricate patterns carved on its short handle and around the mirror, winding like vines clinging to the silver body. Eve placed the paper crane beside the ancient silver mirror, attempting to use it to divine Will Ossepton's location. Ripples appeared on the mirror's surface, and then a vast ocean emerged in the mirror. A passenger ship sailed on the sea. Eve looked at the ship, trying to identify it, but the next second, all the images suddenly vanished, replaced by a lush green park. Eve frowned slightly, looking at the mirror. As she expected, the park in the mirror lasted less than 3 seconds before turning into a factory. She picked up the silver mirror from the desk, turned it face down, and ended the fruitless divination. An existence capable of forsaking Aemon for Klein might also choose Will in the sequence struggle, but she still endowed the paper crane with powerful anti-divination abilities. Eve pinched the tip of the paper crane's wing and held it up to her eyes. The pure white paper crane was reflected in her sea blue eyes, like a snowflake falling into the deep sea. Will wanted to invest in Zhou Mingrui, the guidance of fate. Eve lowered her eyes slightly, her sea blue eyes fixed on the paper crane before her. With a release of 2 fingers, it drifted down like a withered leaf. The young girl placed the paper crane into the drawer, casually taking out the 2 accumulated letters inside, and stood up as if nothing had happened. She had to go to the forsaken land of the gods. Regardless, Eve needed to inform Ouroboros about Will's appearance in Backland. Ripples suddenly appeared on the full-length mirror in the bedroom, and then a deep, narrow passage appeared in the mirror. Eve slowly walked into it, her figure disappearing from the bedroom. In mysticism, the mirror world is a collection of doors that can lead anywhere. Although the spirit world of the forsaken land of the gods is sealed, Eve can still use the peculiarities of the spirit world and the mirror world to enter the forsaken land of the gods using the mirror world as a springboard. Pale lightning streaked across the sky, one after another, as if it would never stop. But in the eyes of the residents of the forsaken land of the gods, these lightning bolts were much more amiable than the pitch-dark night. This was the daytime of the forsaken land of the gods, and at this time, the monsters born in the darkness would be much fewer than at night. Eve looked up at the lightning in the sky, streaks of white light flashing and disappearing in her sea blue eyes. 3 seconds later, she withdrew her gaze and silently arrived at the true Creator's church. Ouroboros was still wearing a simple robe, kneeling, head bowed, praying devoutly. Seeing this, Eve remained silent and waited quietly behind Ouroboros. Ouroboros did not make Eve wait long before finishing his prayer. Although he remained kneeling on the ground, he turned and looked at Eve, silently questioning the young girl. Eve squeezed the letters in her hand, took 2 steps forward, and sat on the ground without any pretense, looking at Ouroboros at eye level. She handed the 2 letters from Klein to Ouroboros and said, I found traces of will in Backland. He also left a paper crane, but that paper crane has very strong anti-divination abilities. Ouroboros's expression remained unchanged, still looking dazed. He reached out, took the letters, placed them on his lap, and softly uttered an as a reply to Eve. Eve saw that Ouroboros didn't seem very concerned, so she wasn't in a hurry. This was Ouroboros's own business, and she was merely here to deliver information and letters. She watched as Ouroboros slowly opened and read the letters, then returned them to Eve. Eve took the envelope but still stood there, watching him. Ouroboros paused, a hint of confusion appearing on his face. Do you need me to write back? No. Eve shook her head, refolded the letter, and tucked it back into the envelope. It's fine not to write back, it's not the first time. Ouroboros nodded, the confusion still lingering on his face. Eve's reflection was in his silver eyes, and he suddenly asked, Do you need my help? Eve chuckled softly and waved her hand, saying, No need. The young girl turned around, waved goodbye to Ouroboros with her back to him, and said, I'm going back now. Backland, Sherwood Borough, Minsk Street. When Eve returned home, Klein had also returned and was sitting in the living room, chatting casually with Ruarui. Eve pulled open a drawer, took out the paper crane Will had left, turned and walked out of the room, looking at the person and cat in the living room, and said with a smile, You're back. How was business on the first day? Very good. Klein stood up from the sofa, facing Eve, with a hint of satisfaction on his face. I received a commission from lawyer Jürgen. The reward is generous, and it's quite simple. Klein briefly recounted the experience of the commission, and Eve understood that Klein's first business deal for the detective agency was a commission from their neighbor, lawyer Jürgen, to find a cat. It was simple and well rewarded, making it an excellent first job. Moreover, Jürgen was a senior lawyer, and befriending him would be beneficial for Sherlock Moriarty's future actions. It seems Mr. Moriarty's first day at work was quite good. Eve thought to herself, simultaneously taking 2 steps forward, patting Klein's back to remove the illusion on him. Then her hand naturally slid down, and upon reaching his waist, she slipped the paper crane back into Klein's pocket with a backhand motion. A friend's student. Eve silently placed the paper crane back into Klein's pocket, then moved her right hand to his shoulder and said with a smile, Miss Lyssandra's identification will be arriving soon. No sooner had the girl finished speaking than 2 knocks sounded from outside the door. Klein instinctively turned his head to look at the wooden door, paused for a moment, then quickly walked to the door and opened it. What greeted his sight was a blonde lady in a black dress, standing quietly at the door with no expression on her face. Although she wasn't dull, she gave off the impression of a delicate doll. Seeing Klein open the door, the blonde lady's eyelashes trembled almost imperceptibly. She slightly raised her eyes, her gaze sweeping over Klein, yet her face remained expressionless. However, Klein, whose ability to control his own expressions had improved, also found his ability to discern others' expressions had risen. From the lady's subtle expression, he sensed that she seemed a little surprised. Surprised? She wouldn't have misunderstood something, would she? Klein's mouth opened slightly, wanting to explain, but then he thought that in such a situation, the more he explained, the more people would overthink it. It would be better to act natural and open. Besides, Eve asking the other party to deliver it in person meant she probably trusted her, and she wouldn't be the type to spread rumors. He immediately closed his mouth, the explanation on the tip of his tongue circling once before being swallowed back down, turning into a simple greeting, Hello, miss. Hello, the blonde lady replied politely, holding up the file bag in her hand with a serene expression. Her gaze fell on the space behind Klein as she said, I'm looking for Miss Eve. Klein moved aside, leaving enough space for her to pass. Seeing this, the lady nodded slightly to Klein and entered the room. Oh, Miss Sharon, Eve said with a smile, waving her hand and walking towards her. The moment Klein turned his back to them to close the door, Sharon quickly stood still, bent her knees slightly, and bowed. Her actions finished just as Klein turned around. She said respectfully, "Miss Eve, the documents you requested." "Thank you very much," Eve said, taking the file bag and expressing her gratitude. "It's my pleasure." Sharon maintained a normal posture, stepping back 2 paces to bid farewell to Eve. Klein had just closed the door and turned around. Within a few seconds, he saw Sharon about to leave, so he immediately retracted the 2 steps he had taken, turned back to the door, and opened it for her. Seeing Klein gallantly open the door for her, Sharon nodded slightly to him and stepped out of the room. "Who is that lady?" After Sharon left, Klein closed the door and turned to ask. Although it was only a brief interaction, the lady's words and actions all conveyed respect for Eve. While this respect was within normal bounds, Eve's identity always made Klein unable to stop himself from overthinking. "Sharon, a member of the temperance faction of the Rose School of Thought," Eve said, holding the file bag in her left hand and a string in her right, winding it counterclockwise twice to open the bag. "A friend's student. A friend. An angel." Eve nodded. Klein thought of Sharon's identity as a member of the temperance faction of the Rose School of Thought, a look of surprise appearing on his face. He continued to ask, "It wouldn't be the god of Bound, would it?" Eve had once told Klein a secret piece of knowledge: there were no true gods on the southern continent. The mainstream beliefs of the southern continent, Death, the Chaos Demoness, and the god of Bound, one had already fallen, and the other 2 were merely kings of angels, close to true gods. This was also one of the reasons why the nations of the northern continent acted so recklessly on the southern continent. "No, it's not," Eve said, pulling Lyssandra's identification out of the file bag and carefully checking it twice. "It's an angel from the temperance faction of the Rose School of Thought." Eve didn't specifically introduce the angel's information, and Klein didn't continue to ask. Such knowledge was too distant for him, satisfying his curiosity a little was enough. "There will be a chance to meet in the future," Eve said, putting the identification back into the file bag. "No, I actually don't really want to meet," Klein silently retorted in his heart. He was worried about being dragged into the struggles of high-level existences again. "Let's go." Eve placed her hand on Klein's shoulder, taking him through the Rhodes Islands and arriving at the agreed location. Eve and Klein arrived at the agreed location a few minutes early, but when the 2 landed, they found that Miss Lysandra had already arrived. Seeing the 2 familiar figures suddenly appear around her, Lysandra's original nervousness was tinged with a bit of joy. She suppressed her inner anticipation, walking towards the 2 with slightly hurried steps. "Mr. Sparrow, Miss Morella." Lysandra stopped a step away from them, her fingers unconsciously kneading a corner of her shawl, her anticipation mixed with a hint of nervousness. Unlike their previous 2 meetings, Lysandra's attire this time was no longer the black dress, but a dark purple dress, accompanied by a black shawl that reached her waist. The style was simple, with no decorations on the dress or shawl, but from their appearance, they were clearly brand new. Without needing to save money for identification, she now had extra funds to buy clothes for herself. Lysandra's eyes immediately noticed the file bag in Eve's hand, filled with longing and apprehension. "This must be my identification," Lysandra guessed with faint confidence. She speculated that there was a high probability that the file bag contained her identification, but she dared not confirm it until the identification appeared in her sight. The black-haired lady struggled to tear her gaze away from the file bag and turned to look at her 2 benefactors, praising, "Thank you for arriving as promised. Your noble character shines like the stars." Such direct and translated praise made Klein a little embarrassed and unaccustomed to it. Eve, however, accepted it well, having been accustomed to 3 millennia of hymns. She stepped forward, walked in front of Lysandra, held the file bag with both hands, and handed it to Lysandra, saying, "Your identification." Lysandra almost couldn't control her expression, forcibly suppressing her impulse not to snatch the file bag directly. Her hands trembled unconsciously as she took the file bag and immediately opened it. The black-haired lady pulled the identification out of the file bag and stared blankly at it, the paper printed with her name, her eyes gradually becoming sore. Plop! It wasn't until a tear dropped onto the back of her hand that the girl came back to her senses. She immediately wiped away the tears, afraid they would fall on the identification and damage it. At this moment, a surge of ecstasy welled up in her heart. Although she had already guessed that it was her identification inside, she hadn't expected it to truly be her identification. Lysandra raised her right hand and casually wiped her face twice, unconsciously letting out a laugh. Eve stepped forward, nearing Lysandra, and vaguely embraced her, her right hand gently stroking her back, like a loving elder. Miss Morella. Lysandra's hands froze mid-air, a little at a loss for a moment. She tentatively reached out, her arms slowly circling, as if to hug Eve, but stopped just as the embrace was about to form. The girl's hands froze in mid-air again, forming a small, irregular circle, like a child's casual scribble with a paintbrush. That circle, suspended in the air, silently breaking a few seconds later. Eve saw the girl's unease and fear and voluntarily let go of her. Lysandra pursed her lips, silently pinching the thin identification document with her fingers. A sense of security welled up in her heart, and someone who had been suspended on a cliff for a long time finally felt the peace of having her feet on the ground. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you very much." "You're welcome. Those of us in this line of work have some connections." Eve blinked, looking a bit playful, and said in a gentle tone. Lysandra nodded. She knew that both adventurers and pirates had such connections, but only the two benefactors in front of her helped her without asking for anything in return. "Also, through some intelligence channels, we speculate that your parents might be in West Bayan." At this point, Eve looked up at Lysandra, and the girl's face showed obvious surprise, clearly not expecting that Eve and Klein could pinpoint her parents' location based on such little information. Either they have a powerful background or incredible abilities, Lysandra thought to herself, suppressing the surprise on her face and asking nothing. Having struggled for so many years, she was well aware of the value of silence. Regardless of the situation, she shouldn't ask. Lysandra pursed her lips, beginning to seriously consider the information Eve provided. West Bayan. Although she had lived on Rhodes Islands for many years, she had heard about the situation in West Bayan. War, barbarism, poverty, chaos. This was the West Bayan Lysandra knew from others. Although Rhodes Islands also had conflicts between the resistance army and the government, it was generally safer than West Bayan. "It's very dangerous." Lysandra pressed her lips together, her brows tightly furrowed, her face showing an undeniable struggle and hesitation. Now she already had an identification document and over £10 in savings, enough for her to live a normal life, but to give up like this, she was truly unwilling, and if she gave up like this, would the two benefactors misunderstand her? No, this isn't a misunderstanding. Lysandra felt a pang of bitterness in her heart. She opened her mouth, but only managed to utter an "I." "You don't have to tell us your choice." Klein looked at the conflicted Lysandra. Clearly, the girl hadn't made her final decision yet. "Whatever choice you make is your business." Klein paused, seemingly realizing that this sentence was a bit ambiguous, and immediately added, "Don't mind us." "Thank you." Lysandra lowered her head, her eyes fixed on her hem, and replied softly. "Whatever your choice, may the goddess bless you." Klein took off his top hat and bowed to the girl in front of him. "I hope we can meet again, Miss Lysandra. May the demoness protect you." Eve also waved goodbye to Lysandra. Lysandra was stunned for a moment, then reacted, instinctively stepping forward and replying, "May the storm be with you, Mr. Sparrow, Miss Morella." As the girl's words fell, even Klein's figures completely disappeared into the night. Lysandra looked at the empty grass, only she remained, and everything returned to the silence of when she first arrived. The girl lowered her head, slowly raised her right hand, vaguely clenched it into a fist and tapped her left chest, softly chanting, "May the storm be with me." Backland. The colors in that perpetually dim house suddenly deepened, like an oil painting, but the next second all anomalies disappeared, as if they had never happened, yet the two people who appeared in the living room with the anomaly proved its existence. Back home, Klein no longer had to maintain Gehrman Sparrow's appearance. Eve lifted the illusion on him. "Will you really protect her?" Klein suddenly asked. The phrase, "May the demoness protect you," from earlier still seemed to echo in his ears, making him a little concerned. Eve stroked her chin, as if genuinely pondering, I'm always generous with help for good children, if she's willing to convert to my faith. At this point, Eve deliberately drew out her words, looking up at Klein, and as expected, saw a hint of relief in his eyes. Eve smiled, then continued with the rest of her sentence, I might consider it. It's also as expected, Klein thought silently to himself. Instead of worrying about others, you should worry about yourself first, Eve suddenly said. Good night, she suddenly stepped forward, patted Klein's shoulder, blinked, and said with a grin, I wish you sweet dreams. The sudden politeness and blessing caught Klein off guard. For a moment, he suspected whether his old sister had been replaced by some high-level entity with terrible acting skills. Little brother, what kind of look is that? Klein's suspicious gaze was too obvious. Eve's lips curved slightly, her arms crossed, and her tone carried a hint of amusement. Hearing this, Klein withdrew his suspicious gaze and nodded theatrically. His clown ability allowed him to suppress the corners of his mouth very well, appearing genuinely serious on the surface. The little joke between the siblings eased the previously somewhat serious atmosphere, and after wishing each other good night, they each returned to their rooms to rest. The next day, the sunlight was blocked by the curtains, not disturbing the good sleep of the person in bed. Klein lingered in bed for a while before reluctantly getting up, dressing, and going downstairs. He walked into the kitchen as usual, preparing to hastily deal with breakfast, but upon opening the door, he saw an unexpected person inside. Old sister. Seeing Eve, Klein's mind cleared a bit, very surprised that he could see her in the morning. You're up so early today. Eve closed the cupboard door, shoved a bottle of milk and a plate of bread into Klein's hands, and picked up her own portion, saying listlessly, no choice, I have to start looking for news again. Klein took his breakfast, reminiscing for 2 seconds about the time when he could sleep in. The Nighthawks, work in Tingen was not heavy, even when it wasn't a holiday. Klein could sleep in a little, but now the training tasks were very demanding, so sleeping in was naturally not an option. As for the future, thinking about the Red Gloves workload, Klein felt that he would basically be out of luck with sleeping in from now on. How did you sleep last night? Eve walked ahead of Klein, placed breakfast on the dining table, and asked. Very well, Klein replied, then thought of his first day here, and immediately mumbled, shouldn't you have asked that on my first day here? Well, I'm making up for it now, Eve said nonchalantly, not surprised by Klein's answer. The tower. Meow. A cat's meow interrupted their conversation. Klein looked over and saw Ruarui, like a ghost, pass through the closed curtains and enter the room. The black cat walked past Klein with elegant steps, heading straight into the kitchen, without glancing back at either of them. As she approached his leg, Klein clearly felt a chill emanating from Ruarui, strikingly out of place in the somewhat stuffy room. Ruarui had stayed out all night again. A moment later, Klein saw Ruarui return to the dining table with a bag of cat food in her mouth, then go back for a small bowl, and pour the cat food into it herself. Having a Beander pet is truly convenient. I don't even have to feed it myself, Klein mused, feeling a slight urge to get a Beander pet of his own. A Beander pet might have unexpected uses, like Miss Justice's spectator dog. However, the thought of the high cost immediately extinguished that idea. He hadn't even secured his own potion yet. Lost in thought, Klein quickly finished his breakfast, picked up his cane, and bid Eve farewell before heading out the door. He hurried to the mailbox, opened it, and saw only the newspaper Eve subscribed to, no letters. Feeling a bit disappointed, he turned and rushed to the station. As the clip-clop of horse hooves sounded, the gentlemen and ladies waiting at the station knew the public carriage was about to arrive. Sure enough, shortly after the hooves, the sound of wheels grinding on the road followed, loudly announcing its arrival to the passengers. Klein reached his right hand into his coat pocket, preparing to get the fare ready. As soon as he reached in, he felt a pointy, paper-like object. Klein was a bit puzzled. He pressed the back of his hand against the fabric of his coat to prop up the pocket, and his gaze followed into it. A neat and beautiful paper crane suddenly entered his field of vision. I almost forgot, it's the paper crane that child gave me yesterday. I actually didn't take it out, Klein grumbled to himself, not bothered, and continued to prepare the fare. After handing the fare to the coachman, he boarded the carriage with the crowd. The carriage was not noisy. Although some people were conversing, their voices were very low and did not seriously disturb the gentlemen and ladies napping. Klein took the paper crane out of his pocket again and looked at it. Although it was just an ordinary paper crane, it showed the maker's dexterity. There were no creases overall, but after being in Klein's pocket for a long time, the tips of both wings had curled downwards slightly. It's quite pretty, and it's a child's heartfelt gesture. It would be a shame to throw it away. I'll put it on my desk when I get home. As Klein thought this, he used his fingers to pinch the tips of the wings, trying to flatten them. He slowly unfolded the curled parts with his fingertips. Once the wing tips were fully extended, he immediately pressed them down with 2 fingers. A few seconds later, he released them, and the unfolded wing tips immediately curled back up like a mimosa plant. Klein tried 2 or 3 times repeatedly but couldn't flatten the wing tips, so he gave up. He casually put the paper crane back into his pocket, leaned back against the seat, and closed his eyes. His posture was much more relaxed than before but still maintained the cultivation and demeanor of a gentleman, not allowing himself to appear too frivolous. Klein prepared to close his eyes and rest for a while, to replenish his spirit. The public carriage did not have strong light-blocking capabilities. Even if he intentionally avoided the sun, when he closed his eyes, he still faced a faint reddish hue, along with distinct small white patches. Klein tilted his head, wanting to avoid some sunlight, but was caught off guard and plunged into complete darkness. In just an instant, all the light was completely swallowed up. Klein's heart skipped a beat. Unless that tilt of his head had blinded him, even if someone had instantly sealed all the doors and windows in the carriage and put a blindfold on Klein, such a light-blocking effect would be impossible. He tensed his body, his eyelids lifting upwards, wanting to open his eyes, but the sensation of his skin stretching around his eyes clearly told him that his eyes had been open the entire time. What's going on? Klein's heart sank. Only then did he realize that he was no longer in the posture of sitting on a seat, but standing in a patch of darkness. So many changes, and he hadn't noticed a single one. I wonder if I'm still in the carriage, and what happened to the passengers inside. This place was too dark, as if not a single ray of light could penetrate it. Klein could only see a pitch-black expanse, hear no sounds, see nothing around him, and couldn't even determine direction. Time and space seemed to have lost all meaning here. The opponent should at least be a demigod. Klein speculated about the opponent's strength and purpose. This was Backland. Even a demigod acting here would have to bear many risks. A sudden sensation of falling interrupted Klein's thoughts. He hadn't moved, which meant the ground beneath his feet had suddenly disappeared. What pathway ability is this? The intense sensation of falling made Klein's heart clench, as if a large hand had gripped it tightly. Strangely, Klein could only feel the sensation of falling, but he had no actual sense of descending. The surrounding dark, completely uniform expanse also made it impossible for him to distinguish whether he was falling or merely being infused with the sensation of falling. If his body hadn't shifted from vertical to horizontal, Klein wouldn't have been able to confirm whether he was truly falling or just experiencing the sensation of falling. Klein looked down, only to see a pitch-black expanse. He didn't know when he would reach the ground, but based on the duration of his falling sensation, it was probably a height sufficient to kill him. Klein immediately curled his body, protecting vital areas. His agile body and balance allowed him to adjust his posture freely even without any leverage in the air. As long as he wasn't killed instantly, he could use his paper figurine substitute to transfer the damage. Klein protected his head with his arms, twisting his body to turn his back to the ground, closing his eyes and clenching his teeth, preparing for the imminent impact. But the impact was delayed, and even the sensation of falling was gradually weakening. Klein was a little surprised, but the falling sensation was indeed weakening. He tentatively opened his eyes, and a majestic, towering ancient castle abruptly entered his vision. The tower was grand and ancient, entirely white, with a cylindrical body, a grayish-brown spire, and a faint warm glow emanating from its turrets, seemingly guiding lost travelers home, making it exceptionally striking. But what was most striking was the silver-white giant snake coiled around the tower. Dream. The giant silver-white snake of fate coiled around the tower, its crimson eyes observing the newcomer, like a mythical beast guarding a pass, ready to devour any unqualified warrior. The scales on the giant snake of fate seemed insubstantial, covered in dense, mysterious patterns and symbols. They formed interconnected rotating wheels, with half a wheel at both its head and tail. This is the snake of fate. The first thing Klein thought of was Ouroboros, the brother who, from both a mystical and scientific perspective, couldn't truly be considered his brother. But he couldn't be sure if that snake of fate was Ouroboros or another snake of fate. However, he was certain that the other party wouldn't harm him immediately, otherwise, he would have gone mad the moment he first saw the snake of fate. He looked up, meeting the snake of fate's crimson eyes. Klein felt no hostility in its gaze, but he couldn't suppress the prickling sensation on his scalp and the fear that welled up in his heart. Klein was somewhat afraid of snakes, and even if he wasn't, any ordinary person facing such a giant snake of fate would inevitably feel fear. He pursed his lips inward, then shifted his gaze to the tower, quickly glancing at it before pulling his attention back to the giant snake of fate, to prevent any accidents. But even that single glance was enough for Klein to gather a lot of information. The wooden door of the tower was wide open, seemingly unafraid of prying eyes. Looking through the wooden door, Klein saw the faint light from the candelabras on the inner walls of the tower barely illuminating the interior. Rows of bookshelves appeared exceptionally ancient in the warm light. Surprisingly, inside the tower, as if gravity was abnormal, many books and writing implements floated freely in midair. He also saw a section of a slightly curved staircase. Judging from the visible part, the staircase should ascend in a spiral. What is this place? As Klein's thoughts raced, the silver-white giant snake of fate on the tower suddenly twisted its body. Its massive serpentine form crawled along the wall, its upper half leaving the tower and slithering towards Klein. Klein's heart jolted in alarm, and he felt his heart pound. He subconsciously wanted to retreat but stopped himself abruptly. Regardless of whether this snake of fate was real or fake, friend or foe, since it had the ability to bring him to this unknown place completely unprepared, he was certainly no match for it. Fortunately, the other party showed no hostility towards him, so he should try not to anger it and ensure his own safety. The giant snake's head slowly approached Klein. Even though he hadn't taken a step back, his breathing involuntarily quickened, as if a massive stone was pressing firmly on his heart. The snake of fate's crimson eyes stared at Klein. Klein saw his own reflection in its eyes. Their gazes intertwined, yet neither moved nor spoke. For a moment, it seemed only Klein's suppressed breathing filled the air, the entire world had gone silent. What does it want to do? Klein was puzzled, but he couldn't directly ask. Perhaps I can proactively express some goodwill. Klein deliberated for 2 seconds, then spoke up. Hello, Mr. Snake, may I ask where this place is? It was safer to feign ignorance when he didn't know the other party's background, and it was normal for a mere Sequence 7 like him not to recognize a snake of fate. Klein's words fell, but he waited in vain for a response. The snake of fate across from him coiled its entire body around the tower once more. No response was within Klein's expectations, and he wasn't disappointed. He pondered whether to continue speaking, trying to disguise himself as an ordinary Sequence 7 Beander who didn't understand high-sequence disputes. Perhaps the life or death situation stimulated Klein's potential. He felt his mind was exceptionally active, constantly and rapidly thinking of possible successful lines of communication. But before these lines could be uttered, Klein felt another strong sensation of falling, giving him a severe fright. Klein's body suddenly twitched, and he opened his eyes. Klein stared blankly around him. The familiar carriage and unfamiliar crowd, it seemed to be the carriage he was riding. He lowered his head and looked at his body. Although his posture had changed, becoming much more relaxed than when he was awake, his body formed a large diagonal with the backrest. He was only sitting on a third of the seat, and one leg was stretched out. He was indeed still in his seat. The gentleman sitting next to Klein saw him suddenly twitch and quietly shifted a couple of times, trying to distance himself. Klein noticed the gentleman's movement, offered him an apologetic smile, and, using his hands to support himself on the seat, sat up properly again, beginning to sort through his thoughts. Was that a dream? And he was conscious in the dream, which meant someone had entered his dream. Did someone pull me into a dream? Or did they enter my dream after I fell asleep? And that snake of fate, if it was a dream, the other party might not be a snake of fate, but it must be related to a snake of fate. I must tell old sister as soon as possible. The other party is clearly a high-sequence powerhouse, not someone I can deal with. Wait. Klein suddenly sat bolt upright. His abrupt movement clearly startled the gentleman next to him again, who quietly shifted further away. I should have chanted old sister's honorific name when I was in the dream. I didn't think of it at all. Did that existence interfere with my thoughts? A spectator. Or did it affect the me in the dream? Klein's lips were tightly pressed, and for a moment, he felt exceptionally vexed. He was just a weak sequence 7, why was he always getting involved in these high-sequence matters? Sigh, Klein sighed inwardly, looking out of the carriage window. The constantly receding trees and crowds entered his eyes. He could hear the faint conversations inside the carriage. These fragmented sounds didn't annoy him but rather brought a sense of peace. Clip-clop, clip-clop. Hooves clattered on the ground, creating crisp sounds in the air, accompanied by the rolling of wheels along the street, heading towards the subway station. Klein got off with the crowd, transferred to the subway, and arrived at the church. After greeting his colleagues as usual and attending class, he immediately entered the washroom during the break to chant Eve's honorific name. Incarnation of disaster. Master of the mirror world. Symbol of joy and pain. Today, I unexpectedly fell asleep and saw a snake of fate in my dream. After chanting the honorific name, Klein didn't leave immediately. He waited a few more minutes in the washroom, then received Eve's reply. Don't worry about it. It was just a short sentence, without context or explanation. Klein's eyes drooped, but his mind was racing. From old sister's attitude, the other party definitely wouldn't be Ouroboros. So, it must be the snake of fate that has a dispute with Ouroboros. According to Ouroboros's relationship with him, he was on the opposing side of that snake of fate. However, no one knew about his relationship with Ouroboros except for him, Eve, and Ouroboros. Even a true god, if not skilled in divination, would find it difficult to divine the result. That snake of fate probably didn't know. To take a step back, even if the other party knew, what could a mere sequence 7 like him do in a sequence dispute? Moreover, old sister told him not to worry, which indicated that he wasn't in any danger. Perhaps the other party had no hostility towards him, or perhaps old sister was confident in protecting him. Klein recalled the contents of that dream. He indeed didn't feel any hostility from that snake of fate. But if it truly was the former, why did it seek him out? His connections to high-level existences, Eve, Ouroboros, Saphira Castle. Saphira Castle's status was also very high. Was it because of Saphira Castle? If it really was for Saphira Castle, then it was coming for me. Klein's lips were tightly sealed, his brows furrowed deeply. The chaotic conjectures in his mind made him feel mentally exhausted, but thankfully, he should be safe. First Saphira Castle, then the Chaos Demoness. It felt strange if I didn't get involved in high-sequence disputes, but I'm just a weak sequence 7. Klein, feeling mentally drained, opened the washroom door, turned on the faucet to wash his hands, dried them, and returned to the classroom, where he was receiving training. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Ian. The Red Gloves training wasn't difficult for Klein, especially the theoretical knowledge. Klein was certain that many high-sequence Beyonders didn't have as much Beyonder knowledge as he did. After class, Klein took a carriage home, changed into Sherlock Moriarty's appearance, and then went to his rented 15 Minsk Street. There was no writing on the notebook placed at the door, and Klein picked it up with some disappointment, quickly flipping through it while holding its edge. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Along with the sound of pages turning, a black ink mark unexpectedly entered his line of sight. Klein immediately extended his finger a few centimeters forward, pressing down on the rapidly moving page, then flipped back a few pages. Brave Bar. The handwriting was scrawled, only indicating a location, without even an agreed-upon time. It was clear that the person who wrote it was in a very urgent state. It didn't look like a message a law-abiding citizen would leave, suggesting it was likely an urgent matter that couldn't be resolved through official channels. Klein's gaze lingered repeatedly on the words, Brave Bar. As an official, it was more reassuring for him to handle such matters personally. If it involved illegal activities, he could even go undercover. But there was no agreed-upon time. Klein closed the notebook with a normal expression, held it in his hand, opened the door, and casually placed it on the table. Then, he also casually lay on the sofa, closed his eyes, and silently recited. The person who left a message in the notebook today. The person who left a message in the notebook today. ... Quote. The person who left a message in the notebook today. Klein quickly entered a dream state through meditation. In his dream, Klein saw a thin, young boy wearing an ill-fitting, old overcoat and a round hat, walking with his head down towards 15 Minsk Street. The boy first knocked twice on the door, his eyes constantly vigilant, observing his surroundings. Only after confirming that no one was inside did he hastily open the notebook and leave a message. The boy's appearance reminded Klein of the child who sold magazines that day. Could it be the Southern Continent Resistance Army, hidden beneath backland, looking for me? But, isn't this review period too short? According to Eve, it should take at least a month. Klein was puzzled. He slowly opened his eyes, one hand clutching his stomach, the other propped on the sofa, quickly rising and rushing towards the washroom. Although Klein hadn't noticed anyone around, the boy's identity was clearly sensitive, and he couldn't guarantee that there weren't observers near his residence who had come because of the boy. Klein hurried to the washroom, closed the door behind him, and took out his citrine pendulum from his coat pocket. At the same time, he took out the paper and pen he had hidden in the washroom, wrote down the divination statement, and let the pendulum hang naturally, touching the paper's surface. Once the pendulum stabilized, Klein silently recited, The boy who left a message in my notebook today is a Resistance Army member. The boy who left a message in my notebook today is a Resistance Army member. ... Quote. The boy who left a message in my notebook today is a Resistance Army member. In Klein's vision, the citrine pendulum began to spin rapidly counterclockwise. No, it has no connection with the Resistance Army. Klein felt a little disappointed. He held the pendulum with his hand, and after it completely stopped, he once again silently recited, The boy who left the message is not at the Brave Bar right now. The boy who left the message is not at the Brave Bar right now. ... Quote. The boy who left the message is not at the Brave Bar right now. The citrine pendulum began to spin again, but this time it was clockwise. As expected, he's not there. The boy's message might also be seen by those pursuing him, so it's very possible he gave a false location to mislead them. Klein applied a slight force to his wrist, lifted his fingers, and the citrine pendulum arced before settling steadily in his palm. He put the pendulum away, placed his hand on the washroom doorknob, and pressed down slightly. Click. Knock, knock, knock. The sound of the lock opening and the sound of knocking occurred simultaneously. Klein immediately took 2 quick steps, left the washroom, and opened the door. His gaze drifted out, falling upon the person outside. Outside the door was a boy dressed in an old, ill-fitting overcoat and a bowler hat. This is the boy who left the message. The figure he had just seen in his dream was still fresh in Klein's mind, allowing him to recognize the boy at a glance. He couldn't have stayed here the whole time, could he? Klein stepped aside to give the boy enough space to pass. The moment Klein moved aside, the boy immediately slipped into the room. "Are you Detective Sherlock Moriarty?" the boy asked immediately after entering. "Yes," Klein said, pointing to the long sofa in the reception area. "Please sit. What should I call you? What do you need to entrust me with?" "You can call me Ian." After sitting on the sofa, Ian immediately scrutinized Klein from head to toe, then habitually observed his surroundings, remaining silent for several seconds before saying, "I was previously employed by another detective, Mr. Zerial Victor Lee, helping him gather some news and intelligence. It doesn't sound like anything illegal, and it's normal for a detective to have a few enemies," Klein silently speculated, then said, "Is your commission related to Mr. Zerial?" "Yes," Ian nodded, continuing, "A few days ago, I suddenly found myself being followed by a group of ill-intentioned people. I suspected it was related to Mr. Zerial, so I went to visit him at his residence. It appeared normal, but many hidden clues and small mechanisms indicating an intrusion had been triggered. Since that day, I haven't seen Mr. Zerial again. I suspect something has happened to him. I tried to report it to the police, but the number of days he's been missing hasn't met the requirement. I tried to ask other detectives I knew for help, but they all refused, saying that they had just seen Mr. Zerial at a gathering of colleagues. This is simply unbelievable." At this point, Ian's voice imperceptibly rose slightly. "Those are detectives with top-notch observation skills. It's almost impossible to disguise oneself as another person in front of them. Some Beyonder abilities can achieve that," Klein added in his mind. If Beyonder abilities were involved, then this matter also concerned Beyonders, which falls within the Nighthawk's scope of business. Ian didn't know what Klein was thinking and continued. "But I tried to contact Mr. Zerial using our agreed-upon method, and I didn't get any response. I still stand by my judgment and plan to ask a detective Mr. Zerial doesn't know for help." "Well, in that case, I don't know anyone either, and I didn't know who to look for, so I could only learn through newspapers, and that's how I found you, Mr. Sherlock Moriarty." Investigation. Klein understood, leaned back against the sofa, and said, "So, you want to commission me to investigate Mr. Zerial's situation?" "Yes," Ian nodded and added, "I just need to confirm Mr. Zerial's current status, just confirm it." Klein pondered, "Then how much do you plan to pay? You know, this matter could be very dangerous." Ian secretly glanced at his coat pocket and said thoughtfully, "2 ways. The first is that I directly pay you a satisfactory remuneration, and then no additional payment will be made regardless of the difficulty of the task, unless you are severely injured because of the task. The second is that I pay £5 in advance, and then pay the remaining remuneration based on the specific circumstances of the task, but this easily leads to disputes, even with a contract." Klein lowered his head, pretending to be deep in thought, and after a long time, he looked up and said with a smile, "How about we try a different approach?" "What?" Ian frowned in confusion. "You pay £5 in advance, and after the task is completed, you help me get acquainted with the detectives in Backland," Klein explained. "I'm a detective who just arrived in Backland, and I need connections and reputation." Klein was not in financial distress at the moment. What he needed more was to quickly gain enough reputation and connections in Backland to quickly access Backland's upper society. The information revealed in Ian's words indicated that Ian and Mr. Zerial knew many detectives. Ian nodded in understanding. As an assistant to a professional detective, he clearly knew the importance of reputation and connections to a detective. "Okay." Ian agreed without hesitation, then stood up and extended his right hand. Klein also stood up, shook Ian's hand briefly, took out a pre-prepared standard contract from the drawer, added the newly discussed details with a fountain pen, and then handed it to Ian. After signing the contract, Klein handed Ian a stack of blank papers, asking him to write down any available information about Detective Zerial, and casually asked, "If there's an emergency or progress on the task, how should I contact you?" Being a detective was only Klein's side job. Most of the time, he wouldn't be in this house, which would undoubtedly create some obstacles for their communication. "No need to contact me, I will appear at the appropriate time." Ian pursed his lips inward, lowered his head, and continued writing Mr. Zerial's information. But I might not appear at the appropriate time, Klein silently complained in his heart. He was already prepared to temporarily reside at 15 Minsk Street, but he didn't expect Ian to have no intention of arranging a meeting method with him. However, since the client wasn't anxious, there was even less need for Klein to be anxious, but to be safe, it was still more prudent to divine every morning. Ian took out a neatly arranged stack of banknotes from his coat pocket, took out £5 as remuneration, paid it to Klein, and then left. Klein watched the boy leave, stroked his chin, and thought thoughtfully, this matter might involve Beander factors, and Ian never mentioned what Detective Zerial had been investigating recently from beginning to end. This is an important clue to investigate Zerial's current situation, and Ian, as an assistant to a professional detective, wouldn't not know this. Klein put his right hand into his pocket and took out a copper coin. Clang! He silently chanted in his heart whether this matter involved Beander factors, while opening his palm, ready to catch the falling coin. Clang! The coin slipped through Klein's fingers like a slippery water snake, falling to the ground with two clang sounds. The divination failed. Klein lowered his eyes and pondered for 2 seconds, then bent down to pick up the copper coin that had fallen on the ground, and then slowly walked into the washroom. Closing the washroom door with his backhand, Klein walked 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived at Saphira Castle. Klein used the pendulum on Saphira Castle to try divination again. After the citrine pendulum gradually stabilized, Klein silently chanted 7 times in his heart. There are Beander factors involved in Zerial's disappearance. There are Beander factors involved in Zerial's disappearance. Quote. There are Beander factors involved in Zerial's disappearance. After the last thought fell, the pendulum suspended in midair began to rotate slowly clockwise, gradually accelerating, and finally maintaining a medium rotation speed without further increase. As expected, there are Beander factors involved. Klein frowned tightly. The boy named Ian had concealed a lot of information. Klein pondered while wrapping the citrine pendulum around his left hand, leaning back to simulate the sensation of falling, and left Saphira Castle. After returning to 15 Minsk Street, Klein waited for a while in the detective agency before secretly returning home. What a hassle, Klein sighed silently in his heart. Sometimes I really wish I could split myself in two, so I could have a Klein at the detective agency and wouldn't have to run back and forth like this. Thinking of this, Klein's gaze quietly shifted to Eve on the sofa. Eve was half lying on the sofa, holding a newspaper in her right hand, while her left hand occasionally stroked the black cat with closed eyes on her lap, looking leisurely and carefree, which made Klein incredibly envious. Klein remembered that Eve had a clone he had even seen. Giving the extra tasks to the clone would make the main body much easier. Sequence 5 inches marionettist of the seer pathway could gain similar Beander abilities. At his current promotion speed, Klein estimated that it wouldn't take more than a year for him to be promoted to marionettist. Klein's thoughts slowly drifted back. He raised his hand and rubbed his temples, then returned to his room for a nap, not waking up until nearly midnight. He changed into a light blue work uniform, and glued some black whiskers to his mouth and chin, which at first glance gave him a wild and rugged feeling, completely contrary to Klein's original image. To avoid disturbing Eve, Klein controlled his footsteps, walking down the stairs and out of the door without making any sound. In the bedroom, Eve turned over, appearing to be sound asleep, and only opened her eyes when it was almost dawn. She was wearing an off-white nightgown, sitting up with her eyes closed, looking as if she hadn't fully woken up. Then she sat motionless on the bed for 2 or 3 seconds before opening her eyes and getting out of bed. Click. A faint sound of opening a door was unusually noticeable in the quiet house. Klein, who had just returned home, looked in the direction of the sound and saw Eve leaning on the stair railing, her black hair naturally falling, her sea blue eyes showing no trace of confusion from just waking up, looking straight at him. "Is the commission over?" she asked casually. Klein nodded, then added, "But the incident isn't over yet. This matter involves Beander factors. I plan to write an anonymous letter to the Nighthawks. Ian might not call the police, and the possibility of reporting it to official beyonders is even smaller. That's truly too bad, Eve's voice drawled, sounding genuinely regretful. I thought I had my next scoop. If the authorities don't block the news, you might still get a first-hand report, Klein said, deliberating. Eve shrugged, not seeming to agree. She tapped a finger on the stair railing and said, Mr. Ian is on his way to visit you. He should arrive at 15 Minsk Street in about 15 minutes, judging by the distance. If you want to notify the Nighthawks, you should do it quickly. That fast? Klein was surprised for a moment, then gathered his thoughts and began to consider how to inform the Nighthawks. Ian might tamper with the scene, so it would be best for the Nighthawks to arrive before Ian. However, in such a short time, it would be difficult for the Nighthawks to make it. It seems the end of the commission will have to be postponed. Klein's eyes drooped as he pondered. Klein looked up and asked Eve, can you disguise handwriting? Of course. Help me write an anonymous letter to the Nighthawks. The content should be about a body found in the East Borough sewers, Klein instructed, quickly walking upstairs. Eve nodded, turned, and went back into the room. As she passed Klein, she patted his shoulder. The scholarly man instantly transformed into a profound and mature male. Klein quickly tidied up and headed to 15 Minsk Street. Not long after Klein arrived, the house soon welcomed another person. He opened the door and, as expected, saw the familiar figure in an old overcoat. Mr. Ian? Klein asked, feigning confusion, with a hint of manufactured weariness in his tone. Good morning, Mr. Sherlock. Ian withdrew his hand from knocking and greeted him first. He looked left and right before speaking. Any progress? I was just passing by and thought I'd ask. No, Klein shook his head with a hint of regret and said, I went to Mr. Zerial's house to collect clues, but I haven't found anything yet. Ian said, not disappointed. This is something we all expected, Mr. Sherlock. You don't need to be disheartened. The commission hasn't even been going for a full day yet. Thank you for your comfort, Mr. Ian. Ian didn't continue to chat with Klein. Seeing no progress, he quickly ended the conversation and left Minsk Street. Disguising handwriting was not difficult for Eve. The elegant and flowing script on the white paper was completely different from Eve's usual delicate handwriting. Eve finished writing the letter and, with great seriousness, placed it in an envelope and sealed it. She stood up, walked to the bed, and pulled back the covers, revealing an empty bed. Zerial was not there. Eve raised an eyebrow, flipped her wrist, pulled the covers back, then turned to the wardrobe, changed into her daily clothes, opened the wooden door, and left the room. By this time, Klein had already left, leaving Eve alone in the quiet house. Dark curtains firmly blocked the nascent daylight from outside the window. The crimson moon had not yet disappeared, hanging vaguely in the sky, but the dominance of light had long since been handed over to the sun. Eve gripped the curtains with both hands, opening a small gap. A sliver of sunlight slipped through the gap into the room. She looked up at the sky, then closed the curtains again, pushing the sunlight back out. She walked slowly to the door, casually picked up the women's bowler hat from the coat rack, put it on her head, and at the same time pushed open the door and walked down the steps. A gravel path divided the verdant courtyard into two areas. The mailbox stood by the path like a sentry on guard. Eve shook the letter in her hand and slipped it into the mailbox. The snow-white letter floated down into the empty mailbox, passing through the smooth bottom like a stone sinking into the sea, yet disappearing within the mailbox without a single ripple. All right, now, let's go for a walk in the suburbs. Eve curved her lips, seemingly quite pleased, and walked towards the suburbs, in a manner in the backland suburbs. Sunlight streamed through a gap in the curtains, scattering and falling onto the large bed, where a couple lay embracing, like a loving husband and wife, asleep. The sunlight brushed over the features of the woman in his arms. After a while, the woman with a gentle face in the man's embrace fluttered her eyelashes slightly, then opened her eyes with a hint of confusion, seeing the man's handsome face. Triss looked at the man before her, pressing her lips together, her heart a mix of emotions like an overturned spice rack. She loathed Edsac's affection for her yet relied on the protection he provided. She resented Edsack and loathed herself even more. Triss pinched her brow, propped herself up, and got out of bed barefoot. Her thin silk nightgown outlined her graceful figure. She walked to the window, grasped the curtain with one hand, and pulled it inwards, blocking the incoming sunlight. Triss turned around and saw Edsack sleeping soundly on the bed, his tightly closed eyes indicating that his beautiful dream was completely unaffected by the dazzling sunlight. Suddenly, a hint of confusion appeared on Triss's beautiful face. Why was she pulling the curtain for this guy? A wave of frustration rose in Triss's heart. She hated this feeling. She immediately turned around and yanked open the tightly closed curtains. Dazzling sunlight poured in, flashing across the sleeping man's tightly closed eyes. Edsack groggily opened his eyes, looking at Triss by the window, who was holding the curtains. His voice carried a hint of the confusion and bewilderment of just waking up. Triss. Nothing. Seeing Edsack wake up, Triss felt a strange sense of guilt. She tightened her grip on the curtains and turned to look out the window as if nothing had happened. The sky had just brightened, but the manor was already awake. Triss saw maids, footmen, and gardeners walking in the manor. She knew that if she left the house and walked around the courtyard, she could encounter coachmen, drivers, and many more people. Triss glanced around casually, then her expression suddenly hardened. She saw a woman, an exceptionally beautiful woman, wandering in the manor. Everyone seemed not to see her, allowing this overly beautiful woman to roam freely in the manor. A demoness. Theosophy order. Triss's mind went blank for a moment. She was exceptionally glad that her mind had been so muddled this morning, getting tangled with the curtains. Whoosh. Triss quickly pulled the curtains shut again and turned back to Edsack. What's wrong? Edsack immediately noticed Triss's abnormality. He quickly flipped out of bed, rushed to Triss's side, and asked. Hairpin. Edsack's one hand gently supported Triss's waist, and his other hand reached past Triss to pull open the curtain. He saw it clearly. Triss only showed abnormalities after seeing something outside. Triss didn't stop Edsack, her eyes intently fixed on Edsack's profile, observing his expression. Edsack's gaze swept through the window, but he noticed nothing unusual, a hint of confusion appearing on his face. Triss, did something happen? Edsack asked again. No, nothing. Triss pursed her lips inward, shaking her head, her tone clearly perfunctory. As expected, he can't see it. Then why can I see it? Edsack noticed the perfunctoriness in Triss's tone, gently held her fair hands, and said with a tender look, Triss, if anything happens, please tell me. Triss exerted a slight force, withdrawing her hand from Edsack's, and glanced out the window, only to find that the woman was already gone. Strange. Triss felt a silent alert in her heart, but on her face, she withdrew her gaze and nodded slightly to Edsack as a response. I just saw a strange person appear in the manor, but she's gone now. Maybe I was mistaken, Triss explained, half-truthfully. A strange person. Edsack looked out the window again, then lowered his head, pondered for 2 seconds, and said, Are you referring to Miss Eve? Miss Eve. Triss raised her eyes, looking intently at Edsack. I've only met Miss Eve once. She is indeed a bit strange. Despite her dazzling beauty, she is always overlooked, Edsack explained. She is a reporter, and at Mr. Melissa's request, I agreed to allow him and Miss Eve free access to the manor for interviews, but we cannot be interviewed for now. I just saw her, but she's gone now. She might have left, or she might have gone to another part of the manor. Reporter. Triss's eyes drooped slightly, staring at the floor, her heart troubled. Could I have been mistaken? No, that's not right. Would someone truly be so beautiful yet still be overlooked? Triss felt a faint unease in her heart. Her hand, naturally hanging by her side, moved slightly, and she felt an urge to perform a magic mirror divination, but demonesses are very skilled at counter-divination, and if the other party truly is a demoness, divination might instead muddle her judgment. Even though her thoughts were in turmoil, Triss showed no abnormalities on her face. She revealed a look of relief and said, Then I'm reassured. I need her belongings. Triss pondered in her heart. The closer the connection, the higher the success rate of divination. It would be best to get her hair to cast a curse through it, to ensure some protection when facing her. Did Miss Eve correspond with you in advance? Triss said to Edsack, her gentle and graceful tone like intoxicating fine wine. No, Edsack clearly enjoyed Triss's tenderness. He turned sideways, one arm around Triss's slender waist, and leaned closer to Triss, saying, "It was Mr. Melisse who corresponded with me in advance." Triss suppressed the repulsion in her heart, turned her head slightly, and leaned against Edsack, her fingers twirling her dark hair, saying softly, "To come to the manor so early for an interview, Miss Eve must be quite diligent. Let Magna prepare some tea and desserts to entertain Miss Eve." Triss's rare initiative made Edsack's heart feel as if it had fallen into a honey pot. He immediately nodded, summoning the maid Magna to prepare black tea and desserts to entertain Eve. Magna followed Edsack's instructions and told the kitchen to prepare some desserts and black tea, which she then brought to Eve. "Miss Eve," Magna said, holding a silver white tray with both hands, "please enjoy." "Oh, thank you very much." Eve put down the small notebook in her hand, a hint of surprise in her tone, thanked politely, picked up a spoon, and symbolically tasted 2 bites, praising, "It's very delicious." Magna held a teacup, placed a cup of mellow black tea on the table, exchanged a few pleasantries, and then left. Magna. As Magna walked through the corridor, she heard a familiar voice echoing in her ears. She turned her head and found Triss at the corner. "Miss Triss," Magna stepped forward, respectfully asking, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Triss held a gilded wooden box carved with irises in her arms. She placed her hand on the wooden lid, opened the box, and showed Magna the contents. It was a silver hairpin, with an irregular hollow oval shape overall, the frame designed with petal shapes, and silver threads intertwined to form intricate patterns. Inside the oval was another vertical small oval, with a sea blue diamond embedded within it, and 5 round, pure white pearls hanging below it. This accessory should suit Miss Eve well. Triss closed the wooden box with a snap, handed it to Magna, and smiled sweetly, saying, "Go to the bedroom and get an unused wooden comb, and let Miss Eve try it." Finally, Triss added, "Tell her it's a gift from His Highness Edsack to Miss Eve." Upon hearing this, Magna's expression immediately became a bit strange. She looked at Triss in confusion. "Miss Triss. For an unmarried man to give such a gift to an unmarried woman is simply too ambiguous. The demonesses of Theosophy Order have always liked to tempt men, watching them become infatuated. If she truly is a demoness of Theosophy Order, she would most likely accept it proudly. If not a demoness of Theosophy Order, she would generally find it difficult to refuse due to Edsack's status." "Go deliver it," Triss said again, her tone carrying an undeniable forcefulness. Magna pursed her lips, feeling a bit strange in her heart. She had never seen Triss treat anyone so solicitously, but she didn't think much of it, secretly noting the matter in her mind. She carried the wooden box into Edsack and Triss's room, found an unused hair comb from the dressing table, placed it on top of the wooden box, and then, holding the exquisite wooden box with both hands, returned to the reception room where she had found Eve, and knocked on the door. "Please come in." A sweet, gentle voice came from inside the room. Magna opened the door with one hand and entered the room with the wooden box in her other arm. "Miss Eve." Magna bowed slightly to Eve, lowered her head, took the hair comb from the top of the wooden box, placed it on the table, and opened the exquisite and beautiful gilded wooden box in her hands. "This is a gift from His Highness to you." Eve looked at the exquisite and beautiful hairpin on the red satin, her face immediately startled. "This." Miss Eve. Magna placed the wooden box in front of Eve, then picked up the hair comb she had put on the table, waved it twice in front of Eve, and said, "Please try it on, Miss Eve, to see if it fits." Eve pursed her lips inward, silently agreeing to Magna's request. Magna took the comb and carefully combed Eve's hair. Her thick, black hair was as smooth as water. Magna lowered her eyes, looking at Eve sitting on the sofa, a hint of doubt and sympathy flashing in her heart. Magna brushed 2 strands of hair from the young girl's face, simply tied them together, and clipped them with a delicate hairpin. The casually falling dark hair was bundled up by a silver hairpin, adding a touch of nobility to the young girl's gentle face. Her exceptionally beautiful appearance allowed her to firmly suppress this delicate and precious hairpin, making it merely a foil for her own beauty. Is it done, Miss Magna? Miss Eve tilted her head slightly, looking askance at the woman behind her, and asked in a gentle voice. The sweet and melodious female voice reached Magna's ears, and she suddenly came back to her senses, finding it unimaginable that she had been so captivated by another woman. For a moment, she even wanted to tell Miss Eve that this hairpin was actually a gift from Miss Triss, but she opened her mouth and ultimately suppressed the urge. Magna didn't know why Triss would do such a thing, but she always had a sense of unease, an unease for Eve. She felt as if her heart had sunk into the deep sea, squeezed by countless currents, making her breathing a little erratic from the stifling pressure. Miss Eve, this is a thank you gift from His Highness Edsac, Magna couldn't help but say, her face still maintaining a standard smile, but her eyes quietly revealed a hint of concern. Thank you for your help with his marriage to Miss Triss. So please don't misunderstand, His Highness Edsac has no intention of developing a special relationship with you. Magna silently completed the last sentence in her mind, praying that Miss Eve would understand what she was trying to convey. Oh, thank you. Miss Eve was momentarily stunned. Then her eyes curved into a smile as she said, I was just doing my job. Magna lowered her gaze and carefully observed Miss Eve's expression, thinking to herself, she should have understood, I hope she doesn't get any wrong ideas. After a few pleasantries, Magna left the reception room with the wooden box and comb. Magna was carrying the wooden box towards the hall, about to hand it and the comb to other maids to discard, when she heard a familiar voice. Magna, Triss walked up to Magna, holding up her skirt, and asked casually, was Miss Eve pleased with the gift? Miss Eve liked it very much, Magna replied in a businesslike manner. That's truly an honor. Triss placed her hand on the wooden box Magna was holding, grasped the comb on top of the box, and naturally took the box from Magna's hands, saying, I'll handle these, you go find Edsac and tell him to come to my bedroom. Magna felt her hands empty as the box was pulled away, and she looked down, stunned for a second. Hearing Triss's words, she pressed her lips together and said, very well, Miss Triss. After Magna left, Triss quickly returned to her bedroom, holding the delicate wooden box. She picked up the comb from the wooden box, carefully pinched a few long, fine strands of dark hair left on it, and couldn't help but curl her lips into a smile. The beautiful demoness took out a pre-prepared newspaper and wrapped the hair strands inside. The newspaper was folded into a small, neat square and tucked into a hidden compartment of her handbag, then concealed with a layer of illusion. To be honest, this spot wasn't very hidden, but Triss had no other choice. Being in Edsac's manor, many of Triss's actions were restricted, although these restrictions were not Edsac's subjective doing. If placed elsewhere, it was highly likely to be discovered by a cleaning maid, and handbags are usually discarded after 1 or 2 uses, with maids not checking their contents. Just in case, Triss left some spider silk on the outside and inside of the handbag, so that even if someone else touched it, she could quickly detect it. That afternoon, at Viscount Glaint's residence, the study door was tightly shut, separating the 4 people inside from the guests at the salon outside. Shoo, Furs, this is the remuneration you deserve. Audrey pushed a bulging envelope towards Shoo and Furs. Shoo took the envelope, felt its weight in her hand, and was slightly surprised. The remuneration seemed to be more than they had imagined. Thank you for your generosity, Miss Audrey. Shoo opened the envelope and pulled out a stack, glancing at it, £10, all £10 notes. Furs immediately leaned in, taking a deep breath in her heart. This was more than all her manuscript fees combined. This, how much is in here exactly? A total of £1,000. You can divide it among yourselves, Audrey said with a smile, seeing Shoo and Furs's reactions. This remuneration was far more than expected. For a moment, both Furs and Shoo felt too embarrassed to take it. I know that for this commission, you enlisted the help of a high-sequence powerhouse, Audrey, seeing their concerns, then explained, compared to your costs, this £1,000 is hardly worth mentioning. No, actually, the price that high-sequence powerhouse asked for was only 3 things, and he even guaranteed that they would be 3 things we were capable of completing. Fers thought silently in her heart, opening her mouth to explain, but then hesitantly closed it. Fers pressed her lips inward, glancing at Shu beside her, only to find that Shu was also looking at her. Years of unspoken understanding immediately made her realize that Shu was grappling with the same issue. Now, Fers's heart felt as if it had been cut in 2 by a knife. One half was saying she couldn't take such a huge advantage of Miss Audrey, while the other half was saying this was remuneration Miss Audrey willingly gave them, and besides, Miss Audrey was so wealthy that perhaps £1,000 was no burden to her at all. This, actually, we didn't pay a very high price, as if afraid Audrey wouldn't believe her. Fers immediately added that high-sequence powerhouse was very benevolent. Audrey, however, smiled indifferently and said, "Regardless, you were in danger because of me this time, so the extra amount is an apology. I am very sorry." Since Audrey had said so, the already hesitant Fers and Shu accepted it without further ceremony. "Your generosity is admirable," Fers praised. "No, Miss Audrey, you absolutely don't need to apologize." Shu felt the weight in her hand and also praised Miss Audrey's generosity in her heart. Even if it happened again, knowing the danger, she would still accept it. £1,000, even if split evenly, would be enough for her to buy the apothecary potion formula. Shu looked at the banknotes in her hand, trying hard to suppress the urge to immediately pull them out and count them, although she knew the beautiful and generous Miss Audrey wouldn't shortchange the remuneration. But what if she miscounted? Viscount Glaint, sitting on the sofa, also felt a bit envious. As a viscount with a relatively good financial situation, £800 was not a large sum. What he envied was Audrey's generous spending, without any burden at all. Ahem. Viscount Glaint cleared his throat. "If you can get the apothecary formula, I will also give you a considerable reward." "We'll do our best," Shu replied without hesitation. Then she looked at Audrey. "We've recently come into contact with someone suspected of being from the psychology alchemists, and there will soon be clues for the spectator potion you want." "Thank you very much," Audrey smiled demurely, thinking with a touch of pride in her heart, "Actually, I'm already sequence 8. Another investigation. After receiving their payment, Fers and Zio did not leave immediately. They casually browsed the books in Viscount Glaint's study. A brief history of the 5th epoch. Rosal's short stories. ... Suddenly, Zio's eyes lit up, and she looked at 2 books on the shelf with pleasant surprise: A History of Loan Kingdom Nobility, and Heraldry. "Esteemed Viscount Glaint, may I borrow these 2 books?" Zio sincerely asked the owner of the books. "No problem." Glaint glanced at them cursorily and nodded indifferently. "Thank you very much." Audrey silently took in this scene, her fan raised to cover a slight upward curve of her lips. As a telepathist, she was very skilled at providing subtle guidance. St. Samuel Cathedral, North Ward, Backland. The scratching sound of writing emanated from Klein's fingers. He held a fountain pen, writing and drawing on the paper in front of him. He appeared to be diligently taking notes, but his mind had long since drifted to the sewer. Eve's report arrived at the cathedral even before Klein did. By the time Klein arrived, the Nighthawks team had already departed. Although the veracity of the matter was uncertain, for safety reasons, the Nighthawks still quickly organized a 3-person team after divination and headed to the address mentioned in the letter. That team had already returned to the cathedral around noon. During a break in the training, Klein secretly went to take a look. The 3-person team that returned had exceptionally solemn expressions, as if they were oppressed by a cloud of black mist, which Klein found hard to ignore. It seemed Zerial the detective's matter was more complicated than he had imagined. "I'll go take another look after work," Klein secretly thought to himself, but the pen in his hand was not affected by his scattered thoughts at all. Neat handwriting recorded the extensive knowledge of mysticism onto the paper one by one. He looked up and saw Leonard sitting upright in his seat. His usual playboy demeanor was somewhat diminished in the serene and profound atmosphere of the cathedral, making him seem unusually serious. But upon closer inspection, Klein realized that Leonard was also distracted. Like Klein, Leonard had long since learned a lot of Beander knowledge from the angel within him. Klein withdrew his gaze and refocused on the training, occasionally checking his pocket watch, counting down the minutes until work ended. Painful times always feel long. Although the Nighthawks' training couldn't be called painful, for Klein, who wanted to re-examine the sewer, today's time subjectively felt longer than usual. After work, Klein immediately took the subway home. He planned to investigate as Sherlock Moriarty. Click, click. The key turned twice in the lock, two crisp sounds informing the arrival that the door had been opened. Klein gently pushed inward, and the door swung open with his force. He glanced at the shoe rack by the door, noticing a pair of white high heels that hadn't been there when he left. The uppers were clean, but a bit of dark brown mud could be seen on the side of the heel. Clearly, these must be the shoes Eve wore today. She had returned home. Thump, thump, thump. Klein quickly ran upstairs and knocked on Eve's door. Before the third knock landed, the wooden door had already swung inward, revealing Eve's figure. What is it? Eve leaned against the doorframe, exuding a lazy aura that wasn't decadent, but rather as relaxed and warm as the midday sun in spring. As the first "I" left his lips, Klein's voice suddenly caught. Because Eve was leaning against the doorframe, Klein could see the exquisite and precious hairpin in Eve's hair from her side. It looks very expensive, and those pearls and diamonds don't look fake. A hint of doubt flashed through Klein's mind. He had never seen Eve wear hair ornaments, her hair was always casually loose. Eve noticed the doubt in Klein's eyes, reached out to touch the hairpin intertwined with her dark hair, and said with a smile, "A gift from a little demoness." Huh. Klein's expression immediately turned a bit strange. He pursed his lips inward, his lower teeth tapping his upper teeth, and opened his mouth. Little demoness. A shiver of revulsion ran through Klein. What kind of appellation was that? Was that a normal way to refer to someone? He lowered his gaze, his eyes scanning Eve's face back and forth, then moving to the precious hairpin, where they lingered for a full 5 seconds. You didn't come to see my hairpin, did you? Klein's gaze was too obvious. Eve reached her arm towards her neatly bound hair, her finger tracing the diamond in the center of the hairpin. Klein opened his mouth, but didn't know how to speak. He "ed" a few times but said nothing, the information hitting his brain like a lightning bolt, leaving him momentarily stunned. I want to switch to the identity of Sherlock Moriarty. After a few seconds, Klein seemed to regain his normal speech ability. He pursed his lips inward, withdrew his gaze, but his eyes still occasionally darted to the hairpin as he spoke. Never mind, maybe I'm overthinking it. And even if it's true, a sister-in-law is always easier to accept than a brother-in-law. I want to go back and take another look at Zeriel's body. Eve pressed a finger to her chin, pondering. Zeriel's body has already been searched by the Nighthawks. If there was anything noteworthy, it's highly likely the Nighthawks would have taken it. Is it for the commission? Klein nodded. He knew that, of course. He hadn't searched the body at dawn, firstly, to preserve the scene and prevent clues from being destroyed, and secondly, to leave valuable items for the Nighthawks to facilitate their subsequent investigation. Klein replied, My commission isn't finished yet, I need to confirm something. Snap. A crisp snap of fingers sounded, and Klein, standing at the door, had transformed into Sherlock Moriarty. Go ahead, Eve waved her hand, remember to come back early, Mr. Ian will be looking for you again. He'll be looking for me again. This is the second time today. Is this too frequent? In an instant, an absurd thought flashed through Klein's mind, quickly passing like a meteor, but Klein keenly caught its tail. Ian said he would appear at the right time. Could it be that he'll just come a few more times and eventually run into me? It was a very absurd idea, but within its absurdity, Klein detected a hint of reasonableness. After all, Ian was just an ordinary person, with neither a strict intelligence network nor Beander abilities. How could he ensure he would appear at the right time? The more I think about it, the more reasonable it seems. Klein urgently stopped his wild thoughts, quickly disguised himself, waved goodbye to Eve, and hurried towards the sewer. The corpse. This time, Klein didn't disguise his clothes too much, only wearing a formal suit, but his face was meticulously made up. His originally somewhat profound and mature face became an ordinary, common face, with some stubble disguised around his mouth, making him look like a typical married man who had just gotten off work. The man sitting on the bench to the left, reading a newspaper, was a nighthawk. Klein's eyes subtly scanned the people near the sewer entrance and, sure enough, he found traces of nighthawks in the crowd. Although he had made some disguise, Klein still recognized them. The nighthawks chose to secretly monitor the sewer. There might also be nighthawks monitoring Ziriel's corpse. Klein retracted his gaze and took a detour to another sewer entrance. Backland's sewer system was very developed. The Loan Kingdom had invested heavily in building Backland's sewer system, making it the world's best, surpassing Intis's proud, Rosal's legacy. Thanks to this advanced sewer system, even though that sewer entrance was monitored, Klein could still reach Ziriel's corpse through other entrances. Klein specifically chose a secluded sewer and only entered it after confirming that no one was around. Relying on divination with his wand, Klein easily found the correct direction. From a distance, Klein saw 3 people standing near Ziriel's corpse. He couldn't see their faces clearly, but he was sure they were nighthawks. He couldn't go any further, he would be discovered. Klein didn't hesitate and turned to leave the sewer. From that position just now, he could vaguely see a corpse on the ground. With a telescope, he should be able to see it clearly then, Klein thought to himself. Bringing Ian to see Ziriel's corpse would complete the commission. But I don't have a telescope. Do I have to buy a telescope specifically for one commission? No, that won't do. Telescopes are too expensive, and Mr. Ian won't reimburse me for that expense. Can't I just ask Mr. Ian to prepare a telescope himself? I'll go back and ask old sister if she has one first. Klein sighed inwardly. If not, I'll just let Ian prepare one himself. Klein first returned home and knocked on Eve's door again. Old sister, have you ever thought about a telescope? Utility room, find it yourself. Eve's voice came from inside the room. Klein immediately ran downstairs with a thump, 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 and entered the utility room in his house for the first time. As soon as he opened the door, a cloud of dust eagerly rushed towards Klein, as if a long-imprisoned convict had finally gotten a chance for fresh air. The utility room was pitch black, he couldn't see anything. Klein turned and went to get a kerosene lamp, then entered the utility room holding it. Easels, saddles, wrenches, fishing rods, a pile of unknown wood, all sorts of things were haphazardly piled up in the room, seemingly chaotic, but upon closer inspection, it wasn't completely disordered. After transmigrating to another world, I became a fishing enthusiast. Klein looked at the dusty fishing rod leaning against the door frame, and a strange thought suddenly popped into his mind, making him laugh. Don't think too much, hurry up and look for a telescope. Klein mildly chastised himself in his mind and began searching for a telescope, holding the kerosene lamp. The silent utility room made a sound again, but only for a short 10 minutes, then it fell back into silence. There really is one. Klein looked at the telescope in the box with a pleasant surprise, took it out of the utility room, wiped it clean, and tried it out. It indeed worked. Then he specifically walked into the utility room again and tried it out to make sure he could see objects even in a dim environment before leaving with peace of mind. Old sister really has everything. Klein put away the telescope and thought of all the miscellaneous things in the utility room, silently sighing in his heart. 15 Minsk Street. Knock, knock, knock. The door was knocked again. Klein didn't make Ian wait too long and immediately opened the door. Good afternoon, Mr. Sherlock. Ian looked left and right and said, any progress? Yes. Klein nodded in response. A hint of surprise appeared on Ian's face, astonished by Klein's terrifying efficiency. After a while, he mumbled, asking in astonishment. You've confirmed Mr. Ziriel's condition? Yes. Klein paused, then said gravely, I found Ziriel's corpse. Corpse? Ian's pupils contracted as he repeated in a low voice. He didn't show too much obvious surprise, as if he had already anticipated this worst possible outcome. Phew, Ian exhaled, then looked around warily and said, "Your efficiency is astonishing. Can you take me to see Mr. Zerial's corpse?" Klein had long guessed that Ian would make such a request. Bringing Ian to see Zerial's corpse was also to prevent Ian from using it as an excuse to refuse to conclude the commission. "I saw some people near Mr. Zerial, they seem to be monitoring that area. If you still insist, I can take you." Ian was immediately startled, a few drops of cold sweat appearing on his forehead. For a moment, he seemed to have lost the ability to speak. Klein quietly watched Ian, committing his reaction to memory. "Yes, Mr. Sherlock, I still request to see Mr. Zerial's corpse." It was a long while before Ian finally spoke. "I will come find you in the early morning." Ian continued, "This time is not suitable for finding a corpse, especially since Ian is currently being pursued." "All right." Evening. An apartment somewhere in Backland. Furs was slumped on the sofa, loosely holding a book in her hands, her eyes unfocused as she stared at the pages. Her hand occasionally turned a page, then turned it back, repeating meaningless movements. Furs. Zio looked helplessly at Furs, who was sitting on the sofa in a daze. After receiving a reply, Furs would always fall into this dazed state within 10 seconds when she was alone. Emperor Rosal once said, Furs suddenly murmured, "There are no free lunches in the sky, there are only traps on the ground." As she spoke, Furs's eyes still stared blankly at the book, as if she was speaking to Zio and also to herself. "Furs," Zio sighed helplessly and comforted her, "if you're worried, you can try to look for opportunities from other aspects first. Your current state isn't too bad, and there's still time. If there's really no other way, then contact them." Furs still kept her head down, her eyes lowered, her gaze fixed on the pages, but she wasn't seeing anything. She pursed her lips inward, then a small gap appeared in her tightly pressed lips. The words in her heart hovered at her mouth but could never break through the cage that had already shown a gap. In the end, she said nothing. She didn't tell Zio that she was almost at her limit, the pain growing stronger each time, like waves pulling her whole body into the deep sea. The intense pain made breathing a torment. She was about to collapse. Sometimes she would think that dying directly seemed like a good ending, but if she died during the full moon muttering, she would most likely lose control and become an irrational monster. "You're right." Furs looked up, forced a smile, and said to Zio, "There's no need to rush. I have a party to attend, I'm leaving first." Furs put down the book in her hand, slowly stood up, and bid Zio farewell. Zio looked at Furs, who was clearly still not herself, with concern and said, "You don't look too good. If it's not an important party, you should cancel it." "No." Furs reached out and patted her cheeks, trying hard to return to her usual state, and said with a smile to Zio, "I'm fine." "All right." Zio scanned Furs up and down, still a little hesitant, but seeing Furs insist, she nodded and said, "Be careful on your way." The end of the commission. After Furs left, he settled on the sofa, flipping through A History of Loan Kingdom Nobility, hoping to find even the slightest, almost non-existent clue. After reading for a long time, suddenly felt that the hard cardboard cover was a bit strange, so he scrutinized it carefully and found a hidden compartment, from which H pulled out an old piece of paper. The front of the paper was covered with the special symbols created by Emperor Rosal, while the back had a passage written in ancient Hermes. Viscount Glaint's ancestor deciphered some of Emperor Rosal's special symbols. Suddenly became excited. She struggled to decipher the ancient Hermes text, silently chanting, "The fool, who doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black, who controls good luck. This is." Jerkingly sat up, her heart feeling a slow ache as if pierced by an ice pick, her hair tingling, and she immediately sat upright on the sofa. This was very likely the honorific name of a hidden existence. HWA's horrified to realize this, and she had actually read the complete honorific name aloud in ancient Hermes in her mind. Once the complete honorific name of a hidden existence was chanted, it often meant attracting their attention. The consequences of such attention were highly unlikely to be pleasant, and might even be tragic. Many of those hidden existences were manifestations of evil gods and devils. This was a common occult knowledge that many ordinary people knew. In that instant, have felt like she was the most foolish person in the world. Not only had she chanted the complete honorific name, but she had also used ancient Hermes. He immediately looked around warily. The table, chairs, sofa, curtains, these ordinary, everyday objects suddenly seemed unsafe, and the quiet surroundings felt as if a monster could appear at any moment. A few minutes later, nothing happened. Pressed her lips together, gradually calming her breathing, adjusting her heart rate, and trying to relax as much as possible, comforting herself, "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid. I only chanted the honorific name, without the subsequent prayer incantations. This is an incomplete ritual, so it shouldn't attract attention. Besides, the rosal text deciphered by Viscount Glaint's ancestor might not even be accurate. This is a cipher that no one has been able to crack for 100 years. But I heard that if evil gods and devils take an interest, they will respond even if the ritual is incomplete. I'm so stupid, really." As she thought, H pulled a long face again, feeling like she had made a serious error. 15 Minsk Street, Backland. Although it was far from Klein's usual bedtime, because he needed to take Ian to see Zerial's corpse in the early morning, Klein rested much earlier than usual today. He had just lain down for a short while when sleepiness slowly encroached upon his consciousness, his body gradually weakened, and he was in a daze, one foot already stepping into a dream. But just as the other foot was about to follow into the dream, it was caught by a series of overlapping pleas. "Ah!" The vague pleas echoed in his ears, successfully dispelling Klein's nascent but already significant drowsiness. Klein reluctantly opened his eyes, reluctantly got up, and reluctantly walked into the washroom and took 4 counterclockwise steps. Being forced awake just as he was about to fall asleep, in such an awkward state, was extremely uncomfortable, and Klein felt like he was about to turn into a vengeful ghost. Taking 4 counterclockwise steps, he entered above the gray fog, where he saw a clear glow rippling out in circles from the side of the fool's chair at the edge of the ancient, mottled bronze long table. His eyes suddenly receiving the bright light made him a little unaccustomed, and Klein raised his hand to rub his eyes, but as soon as the back of his hand touched his eyes, he realized that this action was a bit ungentlemanly, and he immediately put it down. He sat on the fool's high-backed chair, extending his spirituality to touch the ripples of light in a posture of responding to a plea. The scene before him suddenly changed, revealing a blurry set of sofas, on which a petite woman in an apprentice knight's uniform was curled up. "It's not Miss Justice. She's looking at a piece of paper." Klein suddenly realized and understood the reason for the matter. "She should be one of the 2 Beyonders Miss Justice mentioned that I needed to investigate." After pondering for a few seconds, Klein did not immediately respond, preparing to observe for a while longer. After ending the response, Klein leaned back, his spirituality enveloping his body, mimicking the sensation of falling. Klein opened his eyes, returning to his bed, until the door was knocked upon again. "Good evening, Mr. Sherlock," Ian said politely. "I apologize for disturbing your sleep, but I think it should be about time." Klein nodded, went back into the room to grab the already prepared telescope, and led Ian along his pre-planned route, arriving at the location of Zerial's corpse. As he had said, Ian saw 3 people guarding a corpse. Klein took off the telescope hanging around his neck, tapped Ian's shoulder twice with it, indicating that he could use the telescope to look. Ian secretly praised Klein's professionalism and ability in his heart, took the telescope he handed over, and looked in the direction of the corpse. Klein kept his eyes on Ian, observing his expression. Although the upper half of his face was blocked by the telescope and Ian's professionalism as a detective's assistant himself increased the difficulty of observation, Klein's powerful control over expressions, honed during the clown stage, allowed him to discern Ian's subtle changes in expression with relative ease. He was still nervous but a bit more relaxed than before. It seems that from Ian's perspective, things haven't reached the worst-case scenario. Klein judged in his mind. Not knowing which faction's people discovered Zerial's corpse as the worst-case scenario. Klein lowered his gaze to Ian, who was still observing, leaned slightly forward, and said in a low voice, "Mr. Ian, if there are no issues, we can conclude the commission. It is indeed Mr. Zerial, Ian replied, also in a low voice, Mr. Sherlock, do you have any way for me to approach Mr. Zerial's corpse? I'm sorry, Klein said without hesitation, this is not within the scope of our commission, and although I have only been in Backland for a short time, I intend to reside here long-term. The meaning was clear, he was not getting involved in this mess. Although he didn't know the full story, upon seeing Zerial's corpse, anyone not foolish could tell that this was not a simple commission. Withdrawing in time was a wise choice, and it was also a choice that a newcomer, a detective without a reputation, would make. Indeed, after Klein said these words, Ian had no doubts. He pulled his overcoat tighter around him and said, "You are right, the moment I saw Mr. Zerial's corpse, our commission was already over. I will keep my promise and introduce you to other detectives." Klein nodded and was the first to leave the sewer. After returning home, Klein had no intention of sleeping, so he ascended to Saphira Castle, preparing to observe the lady who had chanted his honorific name. Klein sat leisurely in the high-backed chair, looking at the crimson star shimmering with light. That lady should be asleep by now, but I should be able to pull people into Saphira Castle under these circumstances, Klein mused inwardly. Old Sister once said that many functions of Saphira Castle are very similar to a divine kingdom. I just don't know if this lady is the one who might be connected to the Abraham family. Klein mentally conjured the image of a citrine pendulum, and as the pendulum gradually formed in his mind, a citrine pendulum also appeared on the long table in front of him. He reached out his right hand, picked up the pendulum from the table, and suspended it in the air. After waiting a few seconds for the pendulum to stop swaying, he began to chant silently. The lady who chanted my honorific name tonight is related to the Abraham family. The lady who chanted my honorific name tonight is related to the Abraham family. The lady who chanted my honorific name tonight is related to the Abraham family. Klein's eyes were fixed on the pendulum in midair. In his vision, the pendulum rotated clockwise with an extremely small amplitude. Related, but the connection is so minuscule it can be ignored, Klein frowned slightly. This was somewhat different from what he had expected. Klein clasped his hands together on the bronze long table, pondering whether to pull this lady into Saphira Castle. Let's observe a bit more. This lady was recommended by Miss Justice. If she cannot create enough value while sacrificing the secrecy among members, it would be very disadvantageous for Klein. Klein reached out his hand, and the moment he touched the star, he felt his spirituality surge out at a terrifying speed, causing the entire Saphira Castle to tremble slightly. After he lost almost half of his spirituality, everything returned to calm, and a blurry, distorted figure emerged from the edge of the bronze long table. Shu opened her eyes, heavy with sleep, and saw the boundless gray fog, an ancient high-backed chair, and a dark shadow looking down at her. Sleepiness instantly fled Shu's body. Her face paled, and her lips moved twice, as if she had lost her voice and couldn't utter any words. Shu's mind was blank, as if it had lost the ability to function, but her survival instinct quickly brought back her senses, and she lowered her head at an extremely fast speed. Do not look directly at a god. Now, Shu was filled with regret. The honorific name she had chanted had actually attracted the attention of an unknown existence. Regardless of whether the other party was a true god, Shu maintained a bowed posture, showing ample humility. No need to be nervous. A low voice came from above. Shu's fingers gripped her clothes tightly, trembling slightly and creating wrinkles in the fabric. Klein lightly tapped his glabella twice, activated his spirit vision, and looked at Shu. Shu's astral spirit body was predominantly dark, with the dark color occupying most of the territory, indicating that she was currently in an extremely negative emotional state. However, there were also hints of blue mixed in the darkness, and blue represents calmness and being in thought. This meant that this lady maintained a degree of calmness and thought even in extreme negative emotions. Great sir, Shu suppressed the fear in her heart, gripping her pajamas tightly, and asked in a steady voice, "May I know why I am here?" Shu carefully weighed her words, trying not to provoke the other party as much as possible. Klein chuckled and said, "You chanted my honorific name." As expected, Shu felt a wave of despair, lowered her head further, and said in a more humble tone, "This was just an accident. I had no intention of disturbing you." After speaking, Shu's eyes subtly lifted, her gaze gradually rising until it rested on the bronze long table in front of Klein. "There is no need to fear. I am merely a fool who enjoys equivalent exchange." Klein lightly tapped the armrest, looked at the petite lady, and said, "Perhaps you can trade for what you need from me." "No fear. That's impossible. Isn't this the standard evil god?" Shu screamed frantically internally, yet maintained a composed expression, though the subtle twitching of her facial muscles betrayed her true thoughts to Klein. "Trade? Trade what? My soul? Or my body?" Shu thought sadly to herself. "I'm very sorry, esteemed sir, but I don't have anything I need." Shu completely dared not agree to this so-called trade. The stories she had heard since childhood had already shown her the bloody consequences of trading with an evil god, leaving her without a shred of luck mentality. "Is that so?" Shu heard the unknown existence speak with what seemed like indifference. She dared not look up at him, only able to vaguely analyze his intentions based on his tone. Suddenly, Shu felt a moment of dizziness. Her body trembled violently, and she immediately sat up in bed. "Huh?" Shu stared blankly at the familiar surroundings, unable to recover for a long time. After a long while, as if she had finally reacted, she slowly raised her hands and touched her arms, cheeks, and back, then lifted the covers to glance at her legs. All her limbs were present, with no deformities or strange growths. 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 nose, 1 mouth. Good, her face was also normal. Only after confirming she was fine did Shu finally breathe a slight sigh of relief, then pounded her head in annoyance. "I should have snuck into the St. Selena Cathedral's Mass Hall to sleep. Going now still, wait. That evil god isn't still watching me, is he?" The thought flashed through her mind, and in an instant, Shu immediately felt a terrifying sensation of her hair standing on end. She constantly felt as if a pair of eyes were watching her from the darkness, the fear of being watched ubiquitous. A drop of cold sweat slid from her hair, flowing over her eyelashes and causing a slight itch. Shu slowly turned her head and looked at Furs, who was sleeping soundly beside her. She was filled with regret, thinking she shouldn't have agreed to Furs's suggestion to sleep together. It would be terrible if Furs was also drawn into the evil god's sight. In those stories about evil gods, there were companions who died due to being implicated by foolish protagonists. And now I am that foolish protagonist, Shu thought with much self-reproach. She reached out and pulled the covers, her body slowly sliding down, lying back on the bed but without a hint of sleepiness. Fearing the possible gaze, Shu dared not go to St. Selena Cathedral. She could only lie back on the bed, closing her eyes and pretending to sleep, but in reality, she was brainstorming solutions. Tell the official Beyonders. She hadn't committed any crimes, so even if her identity as a wild Beyonder was exposed, she wouldn't be in mortal danger. However, her exposure would likely arouse the suspicion of official Beyonders towards Furs. Moreover, if that evil god was watching her, he would surely detect her intentions and stop her. And if he wasn't watching her, then Shu's action would be like delivering a meal to the Nighthawks, bringing them achievements. Seek refuge. The only high-sequence powerhouse Shu knew was Rei, and they weren't even close. Besides, she didn't believe a demigod had a chance against an unknown existence. After much deliberation, there seemed to be no useful method. In the face of absolute power, all her small tricks appeared extremely ridiculous. A sequence 9 being targeted by an evil god seemed to have her fate sealed. Shu turned over, feeling Furs's presence beside her, her heart filled with despair. Merceau. After sending Hugh back, Klein did not rush to leave Saphira Castle. Instead, he used Saphira Castle's perspective to observe for a while, confirming that Hugh, due to his status as a wild Beyonder, would not dare to inform the official Beyonders for some time. Only then did he leave Saphira Castle. However, to be safe, he still needed to contact that lady in his capacity as an official Beyonder. While thinking, Klein lay back, his spirituality enveloping his body, simulating the sensation of falling as he left Saphira Castle and returned to his beloved bed, until he was awakened by a knock on the door. The knocking was very loud, as if it wanted to tear Klein's door down. He groggily opened his eyes and glanced out the window. The crimson moon still hung in the sky, showing signs of setting but still dominating the heavens. Who is it? In the middle of the night, such loud noise will get complaints. By the faint moonlight, Klein glanced at the clock. It was past 4:20 a.m., and he became even more displeased. Thump, 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 thump. The knocking outside the door came in waves, like never-ending ripples, growing more urgent, signaling the limit of the person's patience. No. Why so urgent? Klein's mind slowly cleared, and he frowned, realizing something was amiss. Not many people knew Sherlock Moriarty. Clients with urgent matters wouldn't prioritize a private detective like him, who had no reputation and had just arrived in Backland. The only person he could think of who would be so eager to find him now was Ian, but Ian didn't seem like the type to treat his door that way, and coming to him at this hour, Klein was worried Ian might be trying to drag him into trouble. Klein put on his coat and hurried towards the door, his hand warily reaching into his pocket for his tarot cards. He pulled out one, holding it between two fingers, ready to flick it out at any moment. He opened the door a tiny crack and saw the visitor through it. It wasn't Ian, but a Highland man with dark skin and deep-set eyes. According to his spirit channeling results, this man was named Merceau, the executioner of the Zemang party, a leader of no small standing. You are Sherlock Moriarty. Although it was a question, his tone was extremely assertive. Before Klein could answer, Merceau continued, speaking to himself, I want to commission you to find someone. This gentleman seemed completely unaware of what discretion was. Both his knocking and speaking were very loud, making Klein worry that he might attract nearby police and cause unnecessary trouble. Of course, it was also possible that this was the gentleman's discreet mode, but this discretion was still very conspicuous. The person I'm looking for is named Ian Wright. He has bright red eyes, is about 15 or 16 years old, and likes to wear a brown, old overcoat and a matching dome-shaped hat. I think you should know him. Sure enough, Ian's matter was quite troublesome. Klein thought with a headache. But Klein certainly couldn't sell out Ian. This would violate a private detective's professional ethics. If others knew that Sherlock Moriarty had given his client's information to someone else, then his path as a private detective would be at an end. I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Merceau stared intently at Klein, his face expressionless, but perhaps due to his features, he always gave off a fierce and menacing impression. This tall Highland man said nothing, turning directly and leaving without hesitation, which somewhat surprised Klein. He's not planning to ambush me, is he? Klein secretly remained vigilant, looking up to observe his surroundings. On the second floor of 17 Minsk Street, he saw a stranger's face obscured behind the curtains, cautiously watching him. That must be Mrs. Summers's husband. Klein guessed in his mind. Sure enough, Merceau had attracted the neighbors' attention. He hoped they wouldn't call the police. Klein withdrew his gaze, confirmed that no one was monitoring nearby except for the landlord and his wife, and then returned to his room. But even so, he dared not easily relax his guard and go back to sleep. Merceau had left too cleanly, leaving him with a persistent sense of unease. He turned on the living room light and rummaged through the living room and bedroom, finding a few old newspapers to pass the time. The crimson moon gradually receded its light, and the dazzling sun eagerly ascended into the sky. Sunlight streamed through the window, falling upon the text. Klein looked up from the newspaper, casually ate some bread and milk, then left 15 Minsk Street, taking a detour to return home. The first thing he saw upon entering the house was Rui eating breakfast in the living. He asked with slight surprise, "Is something happening today?" Eve moved her mouth twice, swallowed her food, and then said, "You tell me what's happening first, and then I'll decide if something's happening today." "I just saw you were up early," Klein muttered softly, then added in his mind with some lack of confidence, "although there is indeed something." Eve tilted her head, one ear pointed towards Klein, appearing to be all ears. Around 4 in the morning, Meursault, the executioner of the Zhiming party, knocked on the door of 15 Minsk Street. Klein paused, organizing his words, and continued, he wanted me to provide information about Ian, but I refused. Then he left. Meursault left too decisively, and it always makes me feel uneasy. So, Eve raised an eyebrow, drawing out her words, signaling Klein to continue, but her knowing expression clearly already understood Klein's thoughts. So, I hope you can stay at 15 Minsk Street is, Sherlock Moriarty, while I'm at work. Klein didn't mind, naturally taking over Eve's words, and continued, I speculate that Meursault or other Zhiming party members might come looking for me again, but I don't have time to stay at 15 Minsk Street for long. I'm worried this might make them suspicious or implicate my neighbors, and it would also help the Sherlock Moriarty identity operate long-term. If Sherlock Moriarty only appeared for a period in the afternoon every day, it would be very suspicious. If there's a commission, just take it, and I'll complete it. You don't need to do anything, just like at home, read books, newspapers, and so on. Klein clearly knew how lazy his old sister was, and continued to persuade her, striving to get Eve to agree. Eve mused for 2 seconds, slowly extending a finger to tap her chin, one tap after another, with a strange rhythm. Zhiming party, I've heard of them. If it's just this matter, then I still have time. The blonde lady. Eve wiggled a finger in front of Klein, and as he looked on in confusion, she snapped her fingers. Immediately, the beautiful lady in front of him transformed into a mature man. He, HMPH, twice, one hand on his hip, the other making a scissor hand gesture with 2 fingers, slowly drawing it across his vision. He raised an eyebrow and asked, how's that? Klein felt a chill, and with a look of disgust, he said, don't use my persona to make such strange gestures. If it were Eve's original appearance, it would definitely be a beautiful girl, pleasing to the eye, with a bit of playfulness and cuteness. But Sherlock Moriarty was a mature man, and making such gestures would only make people feel strange. It seems I need to advance to marionettist quickly, Klein thought silently to himself. If he could advance to marionettist, it would be much easier to manage the relationship between Sherlock Moriarty and Klein Moretti, and he wouldn't need Eve's help. However, with the recent training at the cathedral, Klein had far fewer opportunities to act, and the digestion of his potion had slowed considerably. Eve let out a small tisk, lowered her hand, and said, you can't even handle this, so how will you act as a faceless in the future? This has nothing to do with acting as a faceless, does it? Klein retorted, then, not giving Eve a chance to argue, he immediately added, I have to go to work. Eve opened her mouth, the unspoken sophistry swirling on her tongue, but in the end, it was swallowed back down, losing its chance to wreak havoc. Then I'm going to work too, Eve said instead. Now, I am Mr. Moriarty the detective. Then, Mr. Moriarty, Klein tightened his grip on his cane and said, I wish you a pleasant experience. Klein changed out of his clothes. After they said goodbye, they both left the door one after another. He left first, specifically checking a mailbox before leaving. There were still no letters from Benson and Melissa, only a few morning newspapers Eve had ordered, lying quietly inside the mailbox. Klein let out a soft sigh. Although he had expected this, he still felt a sense of loss every time he saw it. What am I thinking? Klein shook his head in self-mockery and closed the mailbox. 5 minutes after Klein left, Eve, who had finished breakfast, also walked out of 18 Minsk Street. Ruarui quietly lay in her arms, unusually well behaved. Eve opened the mailbox with one hand, took out the morning papers, and took a detour to 15 Minsk Street. Opening the door, the first thing she saw was a neat and simple living room. The owner of the house had not made any alterations to it, everything was still as it was when the original owner left. Eve casually glanced around twice before retracting her gaze. Holding the newspaper in her left hand, she lowered her head and stroked Ruarui's head with her right hand, saying, don't run around today. Stay here and keep me company. Meow. Ruorui lowered her head, trying to avoid Eve's caress, seeming a bit resistant. She let out a tiny meow, but didn't indicate whether she agreed. Eve pressed down with her hand, ruffling Ruorui's neatly combed fur. Then, ignoring her slightly threatening growl, she carried Ruorui to the armchair in the living room, picked up the newspaper on the table with 2 fingers, lay down on the armchair, and gently placed the black cat on her stomach. The small black cat quickly curled into a ball after her paws touched Eve's soft stomach, her tail pressed close to her body, her head slightly raised. She licked her front paws, groomed her ruffled fur, her eyes carrying a hint of resentment, occasionally glancing at Eve. Eve chuckled softly, covering Ruorui with both today's morning paper and the newspapers on the table. The large newspapers immediately submerged the black cat, leaving only a pair of triangular ears exposed. Ruorui didn't resist. There weren't many newspapers, so they weren't heavy at all when placed on her. Moreover, the dark environment created by the newspapers made her quite happy. She twitched her ears, her body shrinking further inward, curling into a ball and hiding inside the newspaper blanket. Eve picked up the top newspaper, shook it, and immediately noticed a prominent dark red circle. The girl looked at the content circled in dark red. A new type of transportation, continued investment, specific details to be discussed. Zhou Mingrui wants to invest in this mode of transportation. She had seen this advertisement, it was in yesterday's newspaper. Klein still had it and had marked it, his intention quite obvious. Is that kid Zhou Mingrui short on money? Eve thought of the bounties Zhou Mingrui had received recently, he didn't seem to be short on money at all. But she wouldn't delve deeply into this question, perhaps he just wanted to expand his personal coffers, after all, no one would complain about having too much money. Stopping the random thoughts in her mind, Eve put the newspaper back into the stack, then picked up a few more newspapers from Klein's desk, finding them all to be yesterday's old papers, and lost interest. She found the morning paper she had brought from the stack and began to read, St. Samuel Cathedral in North Backland. As soon as Klein arrived at the cathedral, he saw a short blonde lady sitting and praying inside. Blonde hair was not uncommon in Backland, but that frizzy blonde hair and short stature reminded Klein of the lady he had pulled to Saphira Castle that night. Although obscured by the gray fog, the lady's features were very distinctive. She was also sitting, but this lady seemed a bit taller than the blonde lady, though the possibility of disguise could not be ruled out. According to Klein's thoughts, after coming into contact with him, she would definitely try to save herself, and due to her status as a wild Beyonder, she couldn't directly seek help from official Beyonders. But if Klein revealed danger to that lady, she might directly report it to the authorities, which was definitely something Klein did not want to see. He did not wish to expose himself to the official eye. I'll try to approach her as a Red Gloves. It's best not to contact her as the fool again within a week. To avoid agitating her, Klein retracted his gaze, casually passing by the blonde lady, and entered the interior of the cathedral. As he passed by the lady, Klein kept his eyes down, secretly observing her. The moment Klein passed, the lady's head lifted slightly. Because her head was bowed, Klein couldn't observe her expression, but he could detect a faint gaze, like a feather, brushing across his hand. Is she looking at the red gloves? The distinctive attire of a Red Gloves, perhaps it really was the lady from last night. Before Klein could think more, that gaze quickly disappeared, as if it had never been there. Illusion. In Backland, blue skies and white clouds seemed like a luxury. A hazy atmosphere enveloped this city of 10,000 capitals. A few streaks of orange sunset glow struggled to escape the edge of the clouds but were firmly blocked by the gray fog, unable to meet the people of Backland. Eve raised her hand and stretched. Since she had napped during the day, she had no desire to sleep at night. She just lay on the lounge chair for a while, muttering to herself, I feel like I'm going to become useless just lying here. Then don't lie down. Ruorui jumped onto the table, her tail gently sweeping over a newspaper, curling inward to encircle her feet. Eve turned over, her sea blue eyes gazing deeply at Ruorui. A few seconds later, she pulled up the blanket that had slipped, then rolled over to face away from Ruorui, saying faintly, "Just let me become useless." Ruorui's heart caught in her throat. Her hind legs bent, and with a powerful leap, she landed steadily on the lounge chair, standing behind Eve. She placed her 2 front paws on Eve's arm, stood upright, leaned forward, and pressed down with her front paws. "Get up." Eve turned around, propping herself up on the lounge chair with her left hand, and sat up, pulling Ruorui into her embrace. Whoosh! A sound of air being torn whistled past. A small black feathered arrow gleamed coldly as it shot past Eve's face, heading straight for the full-length mirror beside the living room door in the line of sight of both the person and the cat, firmly embedding itself in the mirror's surface. Crack! Cracks appeared from where the arrow struck, spreading outwards and gradually covering the mirror's surface. With the sound of the mirror shattering, a dark-skinned plateau man burst out, punching the full-length mirror. The heavily cracked mirror let out a mournful cry under the strain, then shattered under the heavy punch, pieces falling away. Several shards of glass pierced into the man's hand, blood flowing from the wounds and dripping onto the floor from his fingers. But the man seemed not to feel it as he turned and threw a punch at the air. The massive fist smashed violently into the air, the tearing sounds demonstrating its terrifying power, yet this terrifying fist never landed on an enemy. Even Ruorui sat on the lounge chair, watching Meursault punch, kick, and dodge, fighting an invisible enemy. After watching for a while, Ruorui lost interest and slowly looked up at Eve. Eve also looked down at Ruorui, chuckled, and patted her back, signaling her to deal with it. Ruorui lowered her head and pulled out a bottle of orange-yellow potion from her silver badge. She pressed the bottle with her front paws, pulled out the cork with her teeth, and spat it onto the table. Then, holding the bottle with both front paws, she chugged the potion, placing the remaining open empty bottle by Eve's hand. The warrior potion could temporarily enhance the user's strength. The warrior potion made by a demigod provided a very significant increase in power. Meow! Ruorui jumped onto the table, her body low, her tail wagging and sweeping across the tabletop. Meow! A sharp meow sounded. The black cat's hind legs tensed, and with a powerful push, her body gracefully leapt through the air, crashing directly into the tall plateau man, biting his collar, pressing his chest with her 2 front paws, and with immense force, slammed him heavily onto the ground. A sharp pain shot through his back, and Meursault was instantly enraged. He had actually fallen carelessly during a fight. He propped himself up with one hand on the ground, trying to get up quickly, but found that no matter how hard he tried, he seemed to be pressed down by something, unable to move an inch from the ground. Meursault's rich combat experience made him notice the anomaly in an instant. He stared intently at Sherlock Moriarty, observing his every move, seeking an opportunity to escape. Suddenly, Sherlock Moriarty rippled like a red moon in a lake, shattering into countless water droplets. Not only that, but the surrounding furniture, damaged by the battle, also shattered with him. The entire room seemed to transform into a lake surface, and at this moment, an unknown entity was throwing stones into the lake, disrupting the reflections on its surface. Everything disappeared and reconstructed in Meursault's eyes. After the ripples receded, he saw the intact room and Sherlock Moriarty sitting on the lounge chair, with a black cat standing on him, pressing him down firmly. The only thing that hadn't changed was the full-length mirror beside the living room door. Its shattered surface reflected his figure, with cracks passing through him, cutting up his reflection. As if a pair of invisible hands had suddenly gripped his heart, Meursault stiffened. A drop of cold sweat slid down his forehead, his lips trembled slightly, and he opened his mouth. It was a long time before he finally uttered a sentence: illusion. A very powerful illusion. He had not detected the presence of the illusion at all. The battle just now, all the sensations and scenes, had been extraordinarily real. In an instant, Meursault understood. The ambassador had severely underestimated the opponent's strength. This was not an ordinary person, this was a very powerful Beander, and he had no ability to kill the opponent. Meursault clenched his fists, watching the opponent walk towards him step by step. The increasingly close footsteps were like heavy hammers striking his heart repeatedly. Eve lowered her gaze to the plateau man on the ground and waved her hand, signaling Ruirui to release him. Years of companionship and tacit understanding meant that even without any words, Ruirui could easily understand Eve's meaning. She released her front paws from Merceau, pushed off with her hind legs, and jumped to the ground. Mersault's eyes were fixed on the man in front of him, his body still in its original posture. Eve said nothing, returning his gaze with a smile. After a long pause, Merceau propped himself up with one hand and stood up from the ground. Please sit. Eve extended her right hand in a please gesture, motioning for Merceau to sit on the sofa, and asked, black tea or coffee? Merceau couldn't understand the opponent's intention, but he still shook his head, saying hoarsely, neither. He liked neither coffee nor black tea. To him, these so-called respectable beverages were inferior to alcohol, strong liquor. Eve chuckled and said, perhaps you want alcohol. Saying this, she turned and walked towards the wine cabinet. Klein did not store much alcohol at 15 Minsk Street, only a few bottles of red wine and beer as decoration, to add some atmosphere of life. Eve glanced at them, took out a bottle of Southville beer, and placed it in front of Merceau. Merceau was a little surprised. He reached out to take the wine, but suddenly pulled his hand back just before touching it. He secretly looked up at Eve, saw that she still maintained her polite smile, then retracted his gaze. After a few seconds of hesitation, he reached out and took the wine. After taking the wine, Merceau silently stared at the liquid in the bottle. Eve did not bother him, turning to brew a cup of black tea for herself. For a moment, only the crisp sound of porcelain clinking as Eve made tea remained in the air. Eve held the black tea, which exuded a rich aroma, and took a sip. Merceau looked at the person sitting opposite him. After a long time, he gripped the bottle and sharply tapped it against the edge of the table. With a bang, the cap popped open. Gulp, gulp, gulp. Merceau held the bottle in his right hand, tilted his head back, and chugged from the bottle, the pale yellow liquid rapidly disappearing from within. Bang! As the last drop of liquid vanished from the bottle, Merceau forcefully placed the empty bottle on the table, with such force that it made a loud bang. Eve put down her teacup, looked up at Merceau, and asked, who is the mastermind? Allegiance. What, you want me to tell the truth when I'm drunk? Merceau scoffed, then this much wine isn't enough. Who is the mastermind? Eve asked again. Merceau was silent for a moment. The Intis ambassador, Backlund Jean Maiden. He answered in a flat tone. He sold out so fast. Rui paused her action of licking her front paw, and couldn't help but complain, we didn't say we'd let you go if you confessed obediently. Merceau showed some surprise at a cat speaking, but his reaction wasn't significant. After all, it was this cat that had just pinned him to the ground. Of course, if it weren't for that strange illusion, he believed he wouldn't have been defeated by a cat. Merceau recovered and looked at Sherlock, letting out a sneer, disdainfully saying, if you can kill him, you don't need to do it, I'll go to the police station myself and commit suicide. Eve stroked her chin, appearing to be in deep thought. Seeing Sherlock lower his head and stroke his chin, deep in thought, as if genuinely considering the feasibility of the matter, Mersault's eyelid twitched. He opened his mouth and said, don't even think about it. No matter how powerful a Beander is, he doesn't have the ability to go against a country. Perhaps if you reveal a bit more information, I can quietly kill him, Eve continued. She could tell that Mersault's killing intent towards the ambassador was not fake, but it wasn't that strong either. It was more like, it would be best if he died, but there's nothing he can do if he lives. The ambassador is not an ordinary person. Merceau was silent for 2 seconds, then spoke in a low voice, with a hint of unwillingness, he is very strong. Your strange illusion might not work on him. Moreover, Merceau suddenly looked up, clenching his fists and slamming them on the table with such force that the teacup on it briefly jumped, tilting and spilling a few drops of black tea. He gritted his teeth and said, I serve him. Why would you think I'd give you information to kill the ambassador? If you hadn't sold out so quickly, we might have believed you were loyal. Meow. Rui mercilessly exposed him. Has anyone ever told you that you are very annoying? Of course, Eve said indifferently, and we know ourselves quite well, we have that much self-awareness. Yves' unexpected reaction left Meursault at a loss for how to respond. For a long time, he had dealt with hot-tempered individuals who would explode at the slightest provocation, like gunpowder barrels. They would immediately resort to violence when angered, but someone like Sherlock, who didn't get angry when cursed at and couldn't be beaten, left Meursault truly clueless on how to deal with him. He felt a suffocating frustration, like a ball of fire trapped in his chest. You are Alonus, aren't you? Do you know what the consequences are for killing an Intis ambassador in Loan? Meursault said. He hadn't received a formal education, but he had learned some truths during his many years in the Zimang party, and he had even witnessed it firsthand in his hometown. Although Meursault was very happy to see Loan and Intis fight like dogs, if a war broke out, it would still be the southern continent people who went to the battlefield. If it's based on my identification, then I am indeed Alonus, Yves replied. Based on identification, Meursault looked up at Sherlock with a thoughtful gaze. What if it's not based on identification? As he spoke, Meursault scrutinized Sherlock from head to toe, looking at his typical northern continent appearance, and let out a sneer, an Intis person. A Fulsac person. You northern continent people all look pretty similar. Could it be a northern continent person born on the southern continent? No, neither. Yves shook her head seriously, and said with a straight face, I was born on the western continent. Ha! Meursault paused for 2 seconds, then burst into laughter, saying, your sense of humor is truly terrible, but you successfully made me laugh. No sooner had he spoken than Meursault's expression suddenly changed. He slammed his fists heavily on the table. Enough. How long are you going to keep playing with me? The table shook violently, making Rui, who was lying on it, fly up. Meow. Rui let out a small cry, then turned and jumped off the table, landing on Yves' legs. Yves stroked Rui's back and replied, I wasn't playing with you, and I have indeed lived on the southern continent for a long time. Meursault stared intensely at Yves for a long time, then said with a sigh of defeat, I don't know. I don't know much about the ambassador's affairs. If you want to kill me, then kill me. Appearance, preferences, frequent locations, these are all valid pieces of information. Yves picked up a pen and paper from the table, the pen tip resting on the white paper, signaling Meursault to speak. Meursault looked up at Yves, silent for 2 seconds, then orally recited the information he knew. Also, the purpose of finding Ian. Before Yves could even ask, Meursault proactively said, I only know that it seems to be about searching for some manuscript. That's all I know. Meursault licked his upper lip, and with a mix of hidden fear and expectation, asked, are you going to kill me now? Yves' overly friendly attitude made Meursault harbor some unrealistic fantasies, perhaps he could survive. Yves stroked her chin and pondered for 2 seconds, then held up 3 fingers and said, I'll give you 3 choices. He retracted 2 fingers and continued, the first, to be killed by me. Yves deliberately paused for 2 seconds, then looked up at the plateau man opposite him. Every second of silence felt like a death countdown to Meursault. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead, flowed over his eyes, and with a blink, fell. After all, you've done many bad things. However, I will bury you in a cemetery, so you can rest in peace after death. The second choice is to surrender to the police. Surrendering can lead to a reduced sentence, perhaps not the death penalty. Of course, I don't know how many bad things you've actually done, so it might still be the death penalty. Yves held up 2 fingers, smiling playfully. Meursault silently watched Sherlock, waiting for him to state the third choice. For him, the first 2 options made no difference. He was the executioner of the Zimang party, after all. The third, under Meursault's gaze, Yves slowly raised his 3rd finger and said, serve me. I choose 3, Meursault said immediately. Let me be clear, even if you serve me, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll survive, Yves said, shaking his right hand with 3 fingers raised. Meursault was slightly stunned, then cursed in his heart, idiot. Bastard. He stared intently at Sherlock, then opened his mouth and said, I choose 3. As he spoke, He scoffed inwardly, once I get away, it's not certain who will die next time we meet, kid. Ah. Suddenly, Meursault felt a pair of invisible hands tightly gripping his neck, constricting little by little. He trembled, reaching his hands to his neck, flailing weakly in the air, but unable to grasp the hands, choking his throat. It's best not to harbor any ulterior motives when pledging allegiance to someone. His consciousness gradually blurred. Meursault felt his vision darkening, and a buzzing sound came from his ears. He struggled to distinguish it. It was Sherlock's voice. Please, 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 Meursault pleaded with difficulty, saliva uncontrollably drooling from the corner of his mouth. Cough, cough, cough. The invisible hands suddenly vanished. Meursault immediately clutched his neck, breathing greedily. If your performance satisfies me, I can let you go, Yves said, casually tossing a few papers over. So, your life is now in your own hands. Whether you can survive depends on your efforts. Meursault looked at Sherlock, with a hint of surprise in his eyes, and breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. This guy is still a normal person. Go back to the Zimang party. I'll contact you when needed. Nightmare. Inside an apartment somewhere in Backland. Rue, I have something to tell you. Furs handed the sheriff formula to Rue and said, the person who sold the sheriff formula wants to find a helper. Furs recounted her conversation with that person to Rue, and at the end, she added, I didn't tell him that I was buying it on behalf of someone else. If you agree, you can give him an answer at the next gathering. Rue was slightly moved. With her current financial situation, it was impossible to quickly gather the materials, and the existence of that suspected evil god made her eager to advance. Rue quickly scanned the formula a few times, and after making sure she remembered it, she immediately destroyed the paper. Then she looked up at Furs and said, I'll consider it. See you tomorrow. Wait, Rue. Furs suddenly grabbed Rue's wrist, stopping her from leaving. Why did you suddenly go to St. Samuel Cathedral to pray today? Ah. Rue's heart trembled, and she feigned confusion, saying, Furs, I am a believer of the goddess. No, you know what I mean. Furs shook her head, her eyes fixed on Rue as if trying to see through her. This prayer session lasted much longer than usual, and to go to the cathedral to pray, you even skipped today's gathering. No, actually, it's the same if you go for me, Rue opened her mouth and retorted. But Furs just glanced at her, her eyes filled with deep concern and worry. She ignored Rue's weak rebuttal and continued to press, is it because of that honorific name? Furs thought of the consequences for those targeted by evil gods in stories, and her face immediately turned pale, her lips trembling slightly as she muttered to herself, it must be. Yes, I had a nightmare. Rue pursed her lips, thinking about how to get away with the lie. I'm a bit worried. Was it really just a nightmare? Furs's eyes were full of suspicion. Yes. Rue also didn't know if it was truly a nightmare. She privately hoped it was just a nightmare, but her rationality told her that the possibility of it being just a nightmare was very small. Then do you still need me to sleep with you tonight? Furs blinked, asking tentatively. No, Rue immediately refused. I'll be fine by myself. Furs stared at Rue for a long time before finally saying, since that's the case, then I'll sleep with you tonight. Furs. Rue. Furs interrupted her, saying with a serious expression, I don't know when our relationship became so distant. No, Furs, Rue immediately said, tonight I plan to sneak into the St. Samuel Cathedral's antechamber to rest. If you want to, you should go to St. Hilarion Cathedral. St. Hilarion Cathedral is the headquarters of the god of steam and machinery in Backland. I can also go to St. Samuel Cathedral with you. After all, I didn't have a nightmare and don't need to pray for protection, Furs said, still with some suspicion. And I'm an apprentice. If we're discovered, I can take you and run. Your abilities aren't good at escaping. There must be Nighthawks in St. Samuel Cathedral, even late at night. If you're discovered by the Nighthawks, then I'll definitely be suspected by the Nighthawks too. Furs continued, now shedding her usual laziness, her expression serious and earnest, like a steady commander earnestly advising Rue Dilcha. Rue pursed her lips inward, looked up at Furs, and gazed at her good friend for a long time before finally opening her mouth and saying, "Okay." 18 Minsk Street, Sherwood Borough, Backland. When Klein returned home, Eve and Riri were still at their detective agency. The not too big, not too small house felt a bit empty with only him in it. He ate dinner alone and read the newspaper on the sofa for a while, until around 11 o'clock when he heard some movement from the second-floor room. Old sister. Klein put down the newspaper, walked towards the wooden stairs, went up to the second floor with a thump, 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 and knocked on Eve's door. A slight sound of a door opening was heard, and the wooden door slowly moved backward, revealing the face of the person inside. "How do you feel? Any commissions? Did Meursault come?" "It's very leisurely, no commissions at all." Eve shook her head, then looked at Klein with a slightly sympathetic gaze and teased, "Business is dismal, little brother." Cough. Klein coughed lightly, then immediately realized he didn't need to be embarrassed, and instantly puffed out his chest, saying, "My detective agency hasn't even been open for a week, so dismal business is very normal, and my main job isn't this either. By the way, the full-length mirror in your office is broken. Remember to replace it." Eve leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, and said indifferently, "Full-length mirror. How did it break?" "Meursault broke it." Eve straightened up, smiling as she patted Klein's shoulder, and winked at him. Her deep, beautiful aquamarine eyes seemed to shimmer with ripples, and each blink sparked tiny points of light. Even though there was no one else around, Eve still lowered her voice, covering her mouth with one hand, and whispered, "I've got him handled. From now on, he's your man." "Huh." Klein was stunned. Eve grabbed Klein's sleeve, forcing him to bend down to meet her gaze, and briefly recounted what had happened in the office. Hiss. Klein took a deep breath, opened his mouth, unsure what to say, and finally just whispered, "You're making me work both sides of the law." "Go for it." Eve released Klein's sleeve, put her hands together in front of her chest, making a cheering gesture, "The new generation's godfather is you." "I don't want to be any godfather," Klein mumbled. "But having Meursault certainly makes things a lot easier. At least I have the intelligence and informants needed as a detective." "But Ian's commission is actually related to the Intis ambassador. It involves 2 countries, no wonder it's so tense." Klein sighed, feeling a bit of a headache. "I never thought one of my commissions could pull out so many things. But it's also fortunate that I took this commission, allowing the church to grasp these matters in advance. Speaking of which, what kind of manuscript do you think is so precious that it's worth an Intis ambassador's serious attention?" Klein stroked his chin, musing to himself. "How would I know? There were no clues in the information Meursault provided either." Maybe you can look in the library for what masters left behind manuscripts." Eve leaned back against the doorframe, her arms crossed, and said indifferently, "Actually, you don't need to worry about so much. I think the Nighthawk's efficiency in this matter is definitely higher than yours." I'm just habitually thinking." Klein nodded and said, "You contact Meursault tomorrow and have him send me as much information as the Zhimeng party has. As a detective, well, although just an amateur detective, I still have too little information." "No problem." Eve made an okay gesture and said with a smile, "The commission." On Sunday morning, Klein checked his mailbox as usual before going to work. After breakfast, Eve had Ruarui clear the table while she returned to her bedroom alone. She sat in front of the dressing mirror, one hand propping up her cheek, looking into the mirror. The smooth surface reflected the beautiful face of a young girl. The next second, the figure of the girl in the mirror gradually blurred, ripples spread across the mirror, and then it returned to calm. A slightly messy room appeared in the mirror, empty of people, with several wine bottles lying on the floor, surrounded by many wine stains. Ripples once again spread across the mirror, and the scene changed, shifting to a washroom. Inside, a tall man lay on the floor, his shirt covered in wine stains, and some vomit near the collar. One of his arms rested on the toilet, which contained no foreign objects. Eve glanced at him, then reached out, her neatly trimmed nails tapping lightly on the mirror twice, producing faint sounds. The sound of nails tapping glass echoed in the washroom, one tap after another. The sound wasn't loud, but it precisely drilled into Mersault's ears, crisp and sharp, as if tapping at his nerves, forcibly pulling him back to reality from his sleep. Mersault opened his eyes in a daze. The headache from the hangover and the irritation of being forcibly awakened immediately surged up. He pressed one hand against his forehead, struggling to get up, a surge of anger building up inside him, about to erupt. Who? The first word had barely left his lips when Mersault saw the figure that had left a deep impression on him in the mirror, Sherlock Moriarty. He immediately swallowed the rest of his words, his consciousness instantly clearing a few points, his eyes fixed on the person in the mirror. "Good morning, Mr. Mersault." Eve withdrew her hand, smiling as she said, "It seems I've disturbed you, for which I am truly sorry." "No." Mersault immediately shook his head. The hangover headache hadn't subsided, and shaking his head quickly made the pain even more pronounced. But at this moment, Mersault no longer had the energy to pay attention to his headache. "I have something I'd like to ask of Mr. Mersault," Eve continued. "Please give me all the information possessed by the Zimang party that you can obtain." Eve extended her finger again, pointing at the mirror in front of her, and said, "Once you have them, just throw them into this mirror." The moment her words fell, the figure in the mirror also vanished from Mersault's sight. Mersault stood frozen for a full 3 seconds before hurrying forward to stand in front of the washroom mirror. He reached out his hand, slowly extending it towards the mirror, until his fingertips touched the smooth surface, his palm pressed against the mirror, fumbling in all directions, up, down, left, and right, examining it meticulously. It was indeed the mirror in his washroom. It hadn't been replaced, nor did he find anything unusual. Or perhaps, he simply hadn't noticed any abnormality. Is this his ability? A few drops of cold sweat formed on Mersault's forehead. Doesn't this mean he could be under Sherlock's surveillance at any time? No, he shouldn't have the energy and ability to constantly monitor me, but this is still very dangerous. Mersault was somewhat relieved that he hadn't said anything or harbored any ulterior motives after returning last night. Mersault reined in his wandering thoughts and began to consider the so-called task. It wasn't particularly difficult, and since it was transmitted through the mirror in his apartment's washroom, there was no need to deliver it to 15 Minsk Street, which significantly reduced the difficulty. He didn't know what he wanted to do, but that wasn't something Mersault needed to ponder. What he needed to think about now was how to explain the failure of this operation to the ambassador. But unexpectedly, Mersault never received any inquiries from the ambassador. This surprised him somewhat, but if the ambassador didn't ask, he certainly wouldn't bring it up proactively. It wasn't until evening that Mersault brought some of the organized information back to his apartment. Some of this information could be taken without being easily discovered, while some Mersault had copied by hand. This wasn't all of it. The Zimang party possessed a vast amount of information, and the workload was immense, impossible to complete in a single day. Moreover, Mersault had to guard against being discovered, which greatly slowed down his progress. He hesitated as he looked at the mirror on the washroom wall, then picked up a sheet of paper covered in writing and threw it in. The next second, the paper, like falling into a calm lake, slowly passed through the mirror and disappeared from Mersault's sight. Mersault immediately wanted to touch the mirror again with his hand, but he hesitated for a few seconds after lifting it, then picked up the toothbrush from the washbasin and threw it at the mirror. Clang! A crisp sound rang out. The toothbrush, upon contact with the mirror, was not swallowed like the paper. It bounced off the mirror, falling to the ground with a clang, clang. Mersault stared blankly at the scene before him, and it was a long while before he came back to his senses, continuing mechanically to throw the papers filled with information into the mirror. When the last sheet of paper was swallowed by the mirror, a ripple spread across the mirror's surface, and then a male figure appeared in the mirror. Mersault's heart tightened. He bent slightly at the waist and said with extreme deference, "Mr. Sherlock, this is the information I've organized today. The Zimang party possesses a lot of information, and I will need at least a week." Eve nodded, looking at the respectful Mersault before her, and said with a smile, "The ambassador hasn't looked for you, has he?" "Yes. The answer had barely left his throat when Meursault immediately realized that Sherlock wasn't asking him a question. He raised his head in a daze, his lips trembling slightly. You know. Ah, Eve looked up at Meursault and continued, after all, this is my commission. As the commissioner, I am quite willing to provide you with some convenience. Under the gaslight, Meursault's figure was somewhat blurred. His breathing was heavy and rapid, as if he was struggling to force air out of a chest compressed by a heavy weight. At this moment, Meursault finally realized that Sherlock Moriarty truly had the ability to silently kill Backlund Jean Maiden. This realization filled him with both fear and excitement. He was afraid of Sherlock Moriarty's terrifying power, yet also thrilled by the strength of this Beander he followed. This was very likely the most powerful Beander he had ever seen in his life. You are a hunter, aren't you? Before Meursault could think further, Eve suddenly spoke, interrupting his thoughts. After this commission is over, I can tell you a method for rapid advancement. Even though he had received enough shocks today, Meursault was still inevitably startled again when Eve accurately stated his pathway. He hadn't been a Beander for a long time, but he had encountered some Beyonders and knew that Beyonders usually couldn't directly discern others' pathways and sequences. The information asymmetry between Beyonders often had a significant impact in combat. And Sherlock had seen his pathway and sequence at a glance, which meant he likely understood the Beander abilities of a hunter very well. Sherlock's power truly far exceeded his imagination. In an apartment somewhere in Backlund, Furs stretched lazily, half reclining on the sofa, and asked, Shu, are you still going to St. Samuel Cathedral to rest today? Shu nodded without hesitation. The suspected evil god's presence not appearing in Shu's dream last night had relieved her considerably, but that didn't mean she would let down her guard. To be safe, she decided she would still rest at St. Samuel Cathedral. I won't be going tonight. Furs raised her head slightly, looking out the window. By now, the sun had already set, leaving only a faint orange-red afterglow staining the sky. In a while, the crimson moon would appear in the sky. Tonight is a full moon, and you know, I get headaches. Furs raised her hand to rub her forehead and continued, if I sleep on a cold, hard floor again, I'll definitely be staring with open eyes, counting the time until the sun rises. Shu nodded. She hadn't wanted Furs to accompany her to sleep in the St. Samuel Cathedral's nave anyway. Now that Furs had proactively said she wouldn't go, Shu naturally agreed without hesitation. First meeting. On Monday morning, Eve accompanied Klein to sort through the information Meursault had sent, and then they discussed the investment he was interested in. Watching Klein steer the conversation towards bicycles, Eve raised an eyebrow slightly but still showed no interest in investing. This time, Klein didn't have many thoughts. As a transmigrator, Eve surely understood the future of bicycles, so if she still chose not to invest, she must have her own reasons. After leaving, the two strolled the streets for a while, bought some daily necessities and food, enjoying the leisurely time. Around 2:30 p.m., they returned home, unhurriedly ate lunch, and then successively arrived above Saphira Castle. Klein pulled out his pocket watch, and with a snap, opened the golden pocket watch's cover, watching the hands move little by little, settling into place with a tick-tock-tick sound. He raised his hand to touch the stars before him, then crimson light surged like a fountain and slowly receded, leaving three figures within the dense gray fog. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. Good afternoon, Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Queen, Mr. Sun. Good afternoon. Audrey's voice was as vibrant as ever. She half stood, slightly lifting her skirt as she cheerfully greeted everyone. The Hanged Man nodded slightly in response, then half stood and bowed towards the direction of the Fool, respectfully saying, Mr. Fool, I have memorized another 6 pages of Rosal's diary this time. Audrey maintained a reserved and proper smile on her face, while internally cheering a little, her lips unconsciously curving upwards, anticipating what, common sense, Mr. Fool would think of after seeing the diary. After receiving his affirmation, Alger began to recall the contents of Rosal's diary, manifesting them one by one on paper. He had previously considered whether to ask the fool for permission to submit the remaining diary pages directly through a sacrificial ritual, but seeing that the other party didn't seem very interested and hadn't brought it up proactively, he abandoned the idea. This was in line with his understanding. Rosal's diary had some use for a god like Mr. Fool, but not much. He would collect them, but he was certainly not desperate. The 6 pages of the diary were quickly completed, and the next second, those 6 pages appeared in Klein's hand. October 29, Zeratul, the leader of the Hermetic Order, visited me again. He didn't mention anything specific, just chatted casually for a while. I couldn't guess his true intentions. He seemed to just want to strengthen communication and understanding between us. Having already met 2 high-sequence powerhouses from the church, I felt Zeratul was even more powerful and mysterious than them. So, without much hope, I casually asked him what sequence he was at. And he actually answered me. He said he was a Sequence 2 miracle invoker. Sequence 2. In the church's classification, that's an angel rank, a position almost akin to a god. Sure enough, Sequence 2 might just be his previous position, or he is about to advance. Does that mean Eve is at least a Sequence 2, or perhaps a Sequence 1? I told Zeratul my guess, and Zeratul told me that Eve's rank was below True God and above Sequence 1. This is truly shocking. It means there's still a stage between Sequence 1 and Sequence 0, and Beyonders at this stage are already extremely close to True Gods. I asked him again what the name of Eve's sequence was. Zeratul told me that the Sequence 1 name of the assassin pathway is Demoness of Apocalypse. Demoness of Apocalypse, this is the first Sequence 1 name I've learned, so cool. These 2 pages of the diary didn't bring Klein much information, but knowing Zeratul's and Eve's sequence names could be considered a gain, even though he could have directly asked Eve. The 3rd page of the diary detailed Rosal's mental journey in inventing the practical steam engine. He worried about being suppressed, then feared his achievements would be seized by important figures, with every line revealing his belief that others were trying to harm him. It's surprising that Emperor Rosal, who considered himself the protagonist of his era, also had such an anxious and worried side. Klein twitched his lips and turned to the 4th page of the diary. April 18, Matilda is pregnant. This was expected. This means that the children of high-sequence powerhouses might be born Beyonders. As for their sequence, it's determined by their father or mother. I wonder if the descendants of gods are also like this. After reading this page of the diary, the first things that came to Klein's mind were the law of Beyonder characteristic indestructibility, and the law of Beyonder characteristic conservation. As for Emperor Rosal's final question, Klein believed the answer was affirmative. He still remembered the oppressive feeling he experienced when facing the spawn of evil god. If it weren't for Mr. Sesama being present, the Tingen Nighthawks team would have suffered heavy losses. The 5th page of the diary was Rosal's complaint, grumbling that no one here appreciated his popular music, deeming it noise. At the same time, he lamented that, feel good, stories were a common pursuit of different peoples in different worlds. The Earl Returns, plagiarized from The Count of Monte Cristo, was hugely popular, allowing the newspaper he founded to flourish. It was just some daily grumbling, but the last few sentences caught Klein's attention. Quote, "Holy crap, there's a ghost. No, it's a wraith. Scared the hell out of me. Tomorrow I'm going to find a Beyonder from the sun pathway to exorcise her. Quote, Found a professional to exorcise the wraith. It shouldn't come back, right? But on second thought, that wraith seemed quite beautiful. Although I didn't see her face clearly, I feel she must have been a beauty in life." Upon seeing this, if it were normal times, Klein would surely twitch his lips and silently grumble, "As expected of you, great emperor," but at this moment, his attention was completely drawn to the last sentence. That professional's quality control wasn't strict, but I can't blame him. After all, that wasn't a ghost, it was a fellow countryman. Speaking of which, my fellow countryman is truly a beauty, hee. Klein reread it several times before retracting his gaze, silently pondering in his mind, The time of this diary entry must be very early, recording the first meeting between old sister and the great emperor. With a subtle mix of feelings, Klein sighed helplessly in his heart and turned to the sixth, and final, page. November 10th, I secretly met with the great pirate Savigny Solomon at White Maple Palace. I hoped he would plunder my rivals on the new shipping routes, striking at the ships of Fulsac, Loan, and Faysac. And I promised to help him advance to a high sequence. Savigny has a child named Nast Solomon. My intuition tells me he will dominate the 5 seas in the future. Dragon Pathway. Nast Solomon, King of 5 Seas, Nast, who claimed to be a descendant of the Solomon Empire. He was actually born during Rosel's time. Klein was stunned for a moment, but then quickly regained his composure. Demigods of certain pathways possess long lifespans. Since Kilangos, a pirate general, had the strength of sequence 5, then the King of 5 Seas must at least be a demigod. Because Rosel mentioned the term, new sea route, Klein easily determined the corresponding year. The discovery of the new sea route in the southern continent happened in 1194, while Rosel's assassination was in 1198. That diary entry could only be from between those 2 years. That is to say, it was 151 to 155 years ago. Klein collected his thoughts, glanced around, and as the paper dissolved in his hand, he said, "You may now exchange freely." Seeing that Mr. Fool didn't recall any common knowledge, Audrey was slightly disappointed but immediately perked up again. Her eyes flashed as she asked, "Mr. Sun, may I exchange information about dragons with you?" The ancient name for the spectator pathway was the Dragon Pathway, which made Audrey extremely interested. She still had a long time before her next advancement. The psychiatrist formula was acquired, and materials were being prepared, so she wasn't in a hurry. Therefore, she planned to exchange some interesting knowledge from Sun. If the City of Silver also used gold pounds, it would be great, Audrey thought with some disappointment, as this was the easiest item for her to acquire for trade in the Tarot Club. Yes, Derek nodded, then asked, "Have you found the Barred Pathway Sequence 8 potion formula?" "I'm very sorry," Audrey shook her head, saying with a hint of apology, "I will find it as soon as possible." Because she didn't want to expose too much information to Miss Eve, Audrey deliberately avoided her and Rui when purchasing the formula, only able to acquire it through channels from Furs, Zio, and Sherman. Mr. Sun knows the acting method, Audrey calculated the time in her mind. Sun's potion should be almost fully digested. Audrey's heart tightened instantly, and her hands, resting on her knees, unconsciously curled up, gripping her skirt. She knew the predicament of the City of Silver. Mr. Sun's desire for advancement must be very strong. Thinking of this, Audrey couldn't help but feel a bit guilty. She raised her eyes and scanned the room, her gaze moving back and forth between Empress and Hanged Man. Miss Empress and Mr. Hanged Man should also have many channels. If I really can't find it, I can try to purchase it from them. Amidst her racing thoughts, Audrey withdrew her gaze and refocused her attention on Derek. The spectator's powerful observational skills and Sun's poor emotional concealment ability allowed Audrey to sense his disappointment even through the thick gray fog. Sun Derek's gaze swept over the figures seated at the bronze long table, briefly lingering on Empress and Hanged Man before returning to Audrey. He opened his mouth, then hesitated for 2 seconds and closed it again, finally just nodding at her. It seems Sun wanted to ask Miss Empress and Mr. Hanged Man for the formula, but he probably also thought that I might ask them if I couldn't obtain it. "I have a channel to acquire the Light Supplicant formula," Eve suddenly interjected. "But I can't give it to you now. If you want to get the formula quickly, you can ask Mr. Fool. My old sister understands me." Klein was delighted. He had almost been burned to death by the eternal blazing sun to get the Light Supplicant formula. If he couldn't sell it, it would be a huge loss. Mr. Fool has the Light Supplicant formula. Audrey was instantly overjoyed, her eyes shining as she looked at the figure obscured by thick fog at the head of the table. "Respected Mr. Fool, what price do I need to pay to exchange for the Light Supplicant formula?" "The price does not need to be paid immediately. Perhaps in the future, my dependents will need help with something. The fact that Fool and Fool's attendants always lack gold pounds is too detrimental to Fool's image, and Klein is not currently short of gold pounds, so it would be better to save this transaction for when it is needed. Klein pressed his hand down, and a yellowish-brown parchment appeared before him, bearing the light supplicant potion formula, including alternative materials and ancient names, all translated into giant language. Main ingredients: 1 piece of luminous stone or powder of scorching white soul, blood of a mirror hedgehog or heart of a magma behemoth. Auxiliary ingredients: 1 golden-edged sunflower, 3 drops of aconite juice. With a gentle push from him, the parchment appeared before Audrey and Derek. Derek carefully read the formula several times, making sure he had memorized all the details, before looking up and saying, "Miss Justice, we can now exchange." Audrey immediately raised her arm and said, "Mr. Fool, I request a private exchange." Klein nodded, blocking Hanged Man. Although it was a private exchange, only Mr. Hanged Man was truly blocked out. Poor Mr. Hanged Man, you were not invited. At this moment, even Klein reached an unimaginable tacit understanding. Hanged Man didn't know he had been isolated. Although he had some interest in information about dragons, that interest wasn't enough for him to pay the price to eavesdrop. He felt no disappointment and simply sat quietly on the bronze chair, waiting for the two to finish their conversation. The dragon race was the mortal enemy of the giant court, they were the rulers of the sky. It's Western dragons, Klein thought to himself, not surprised, after all, it's a Western fantasy world. Some of them possess fire breath. In the City of Silver, we generally refer to it as the dragon pathway. Derek continued, at that time, the dragon race was the most powerful and terrifying. It will surely play out and become reality. Eve looked up at Derek, then slowly withdrew her gaze. This time, Derek only spoke about the knowledge of the dragon race, without mentioning any related information about giants, elves, or other species. It seems he already understood the value of the City of Silver's common knowledge and history within the Tarot Club. The items it imagines will materialize, the kingdom it fantasizes about will descend upon the material world, and the future it proclaims will surely play out and become reality. Klein savored this sentence, and the more he did, the more chilling he found it. Such an ability was truly terrifying. Its son, Alzuhad, the nightmare dragon, is equally terrifying. He will create all sorts of coincidences, turning the fates of many living beings towards tragedy. What a nasty dragon, but his ability is truly interesting, Audrey thought, half sighing, half excited. Is this the high sequence of the spectator pathway? How interesting. The interest brought by such an interesting ability immediately surpassed the disappointment caused by the spectator pathway's lack of combat ability in its early stages. Audrey felt that she would never switch pathways in her life. She now wished she could advance to psychiatrist immediately. 2 or 3 millennia have passed since the history of the dragon race and the giant royal family. Everything I know comes from textbooks and legends, and I cannot guarantee its authenticity, Derek sincerely cautioned. At least your history hasn't been broken. Audrey listened very attentively. She comforted him in a good mood. What happened next? Derek recounted in a heavy tone, narrating that weighty history. The Lord who created everything awoke. The dragon of imagination and the dragon of nightmare, along with other famous dragons, fell from the sky. They lost everything, including their lives, and the dragon race declined from then on, only able to cower in treacherous corners. After that, the giant court was also destroyed by the Lord. How is this completely different from the history I know? Shouldn't it be the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of storms, and the God of knowledge and wisdom leading humans to defeat the giants and dragons? Audrey was utterly confused, clearly quite shocked. If what the sun said was true, then the widely circulated creation myth was false. In an instant, Audrey broke out in a cold sweat and immediately pulled back her thoughts, not daring to continue thinking. Perhaps the history of the City of Silver also has inaccuracies, Audrey comforted herself inwardly, her eyes subconsciously glancing at the figure at the head of the long table. The fool's figure was shrouded in thick fog. He still sat on the bronze chair, maintaining a leisurely posture, as if the astonishing intelligence had no effect on him. Audrey paused slightly. She looked at the figure behind the gray fog, pursed her lips, and slowly withdrew her gaze. She thought of the true creator, this former true God, now an evil God. How much of the current church's history is true, and how much is false? It's truly alarming. Audrey suppressed the unusual feeling in her heart, and the calm facade of a spectator showed some cracks. However, this is not something I can explore right now. Thinking this, Audrey re-entered the spectator state, her mood quite good as she curled the corners of her lips. The son, Derek, paused for 2 seconds, then continued, "I've said all I know." "Thank you, I'm very satisfied," Audrey said. "What should I pay for this information? Heart of a lava behemoth or blood of a mirror porcupine? A sequence 7 Beander potion formula in exchange for a sequence 9 Beander potion formula and a sequence 8 Beander potion formula," Derek calculated in his mind. He wasn't sure of the value of Beander potion formulas where justice was located, but it shouldn't be too different from the City of Silver. The value of the sequence 7 Beander potion formula he gave would still have some left, and with this information, it should be enough to exchange for a main ingredient for a light supplicant. After the Tarot Club members chatted for a while, Klein announced the end of the week's meeting and sent the Hanged Man, Justice, and the Sun all back. "How is your Beander potion digestion going?" Eve opened her eyes and looked at Klein opposite her, asking. Today, the Sun sought to buy a formula at the Tarot Club, which gave Eve a whim to ask Klein about his study progress. "Average," Klein said with a hint of distress. "Ever since I joined the Red Gloves, my digestion progress has slowed down." I can understand. Although the Church of the Night has provided you with many conveniences, it has also hindered your growth." Eve waved her hand and said nonchalantly, "But it's impossible for you to leave. Official Beyonders don't have a concept of resignation. Although you could fake your death to leave, you certainly wouldn't want Melissa and Benson to receive news of your death." Hearing Melissa and Benson, Klein paused for a few seconds. Thinking of the mailbox that had never received any letters, a sense of guilt and loneliness arose in his heart. "I wonder how Melissa and Benson are doing." Klein sighed slightly, leaning back, his whole body spread out on the sofa, his eyes gazing at the ceiling, his gaze a bit unfocused, clearly distracted. His thoughts might have already drifted to Tingnan. After a long while, he turned over, lying on his side on the sofa, facing Eve, and said faintly, "I really want to go see them." Eve looked at Klein, who was lying dispiritedly on the sofa, raised an eyebrow, and with a push of her waist, sat up from the sofa, saying, "Let's go, old sister will take you to visit your family." As she spoke, she grabbed Klein's wrist, about to pull him up. Wait. Klein was pulled by Eve, half his body hanging off the sofa. He raised his head, immediately gripping Eve's hand that was pulling him with his other hand, pulling himself back, and said, "Let's not." Eve lowered her head, her bright eyes meeting Klein's. She slowly released her hand, waiting for him to speak. "It's better not to disturb their lives." Klein pursed his lips, raised his head, his gaze just bumped into Eve's deep sea blue eyes. The eyes that had seen the scenery for 3,000 years were looking at him. Met Eve's deep, sea blue eyes. Those eyes, which had seen 3 millennia of scenery, were looking at him. Klein felt as if he had been pricked, his gaze immediately shrinking back, then darting up, down, left, and right, as if this ordinary living room was some rare work of art that needed to be carefully admired. Eve stood beside Klein, saying nothing, just watching him silently. For a moment, the air was filled with silence. In the inexplicable quietness, Klein was the first to give in. He lowered his head under Eve's gaze and explained to himself, "If we were seen, how awkward would that be? And if they wanted to see me?" Klein's lips moved twice, but the rest of his words ultimately remained unsaid. If they wanted to see him, they would naturally. But what about him? If he wanted to see them, he wouldn't have even sent a letter. What about him then? Hadn't he also neither sent a letter nor met them? "Do you know what you're like right now?" Eve took 2 steps back and, without waiting for Klein to answer, said to herself, the mute female lead in an idol drama. "It's not the same," Klein was not in the mood for jokes. In our situation, it's a good thing Melissa and Benson haven't killed me. But they didn't kill you, and they didn't even report you to the church. Eve crossed her arms and glanced at Klein, observing him slightly. Seeing him turn his head away, she waved her hand, ending the topic. There's a Beander gathering tonight at the Brave Bar. Are you going? Yes. He had been in Backland for some time, and Klein had not yet participated in any Beander gatherings other than the Tarot Club. More channels were always good, and he could also see if there were any Beander items that could enhance his combat power. Klein paused after speaking, seemingly deep in thought. After a long while, he said, next Monday. Well, it's almost time. That's Admiralsel's 2 gold pounds per month. I plan to return to Tingen to collect those 2 gold pounds. Eve nodded, saying nothing. Night is often the busiest time for bars. Workers, tired from a day's labor, finally have time to enjoy some rare pleasure with their meager savings, their minds numbed by alcohol temporarily forgetting their work. Even some wealthy vagrants would clutch 1 or 2 copper pennies and come to the bar to order a glass of cheap beer, find a corner to huddle in, and then guzzle it down, goo, into their stomachs, before falling asleep in the corner, whether drunk or not. If they were drunk, they were drunk, and if they weren't, they were still drunk, and as long as they didn't bother anyone, no one would care. The smell of smoke and alcohol, sweat, and the aroma of food, all kinds of scents mixed together, wafted through the bar, drilling into people's noses. Eve walked in front, entering the bar first. The exceptionally beautiful girl entered the noisy bar, yet did not cause a single stir, as if no one noticed her, still going about their business. Amidst the clamor, occasional curses and snores would overpower other sounds and drift into people's ears. Klein lagged a step behind Eve, walking behind her, and entered the bar, his eyes darting left and right, surveying the place. As expected, there were 2 stages, one for dog and rat fights, and the other for 2 boxers engaging in a brutal, flesh-pounding match. Eve walked to the counter, ordered 2 cheese steaks and a Southwell beer, 1 steak to go, then waved him over, signaling Klein to order. Since the gathering was at Brave Bar, Eve had brought Klein and Rui here in advance, also to have dinner. Klein glanced at the menu, noticing there weren't many dishes. He looked through them one by one and finally ordered a cheese steak and a Southwell beer. The bartender placed 2 beers on the counter and then busied himself wiping glasses. Eve lifted the handbag containing Rui higher, hanging it on her arm, picked up her beer, took a sip, and said, there's still some time before dinner, want to go play for a bit? Play what? Klein asked. Billiards, Texas Hold'em, or you can watch the matches here if you like, Eve said, pointing to the 2 stages in the center of the bar. Billiards. Texas Hold'em. It must be you again, Great Emperor, you really don't leave anything for the latecomers. Klein grumbled internally, then casually said, whatever. Then Texas Hold'em it is, Eve said, holding her glass. Maybe we'll run into an acquaintance. An acquaintance? Yes, Sharon, you've met her, Eve said, holding her Southwell beer, walking a step ahead of Klein, leading him to the card room. A friend's student, she sometimes watches Marich play cards here. As they spoke, the 2 had already arrived in front of the card room. Eve turned sideways, her ear pressed against the wooden door, listening to the sounds inside, then retreated 2 steps and tried another room. What are you doing? Klein looked at Eve's sneaky behavior, not knowing what to say, and somewhat speechlessly remarked, you look very suspicious right now, you know. I'm looking for Sharon. Eve straightened up, her free hand pressing on the doorknob, applying a slight push backward, revealing the scene inside. See, found her. Klein looked through the door. Inside, about a dozen people were playing Texas Hold'em, and a blonde lady sat beside them, resting her chin on her hand, watching the card table. Hearing the door open, the blonde lady immediately looked over, and upon seeing them, she stood up. At the same time, a man at the card table, wearing a black vest and white shirt, also stood up. After the man stood up, everyone else at the table stopped their actions, frozen in place. Klein subtly frowned. Apart from the man who stood up, everyone else at the card tables had an indescribably eerie aura. He activated his spirit vision and looked at the abnormal people at those card tables. Then Klein saw a deep black. The aura colors of all those people were deep black. This indicated that, except for the man who stood up and the blonde lady, everyone else was a zombie. The man in the white shirt took 2 steps forward. As he got closer, Klein saw his eyes filled with intense malice, and he immediately felt a surge of vigilance, his body tensing slightly. As Klein observed them, Sharon and Marich also paid attention to Klein. Upon seeing Eve push open the door and enter, both of them immediately stood up, and then at the first moment, they also noticed Klein behind her. A hint of surprise flashed in both their hearts, but it didn't show on their faces as they respectfully said, "Good evening, Your Excellency Eve." Good evening, Eve chuckled. "You don't mind if I wait here for a bit, do you?" "It's our honor," Sharon replied with her usual calm tone. At the same time, Eve's handbag stirred twice, making a small sound, and then a black cat poked its head out from it. Her brown eyes looked left and right, her front paws resting on the handbag as she used all 4 limbs to leap out of the bag. A ripple appeared in Sharon's calm eyes, and she said expressionlessly, "Good evening, Your Excellency Rui Rui." Marich immediately followed Sharon, offering his greetings. After Rui Rui responded to each in turn, she jumped onto an unoccupied chair, licked her front paws, and groomed her somewhat disheveled fur. "Do you want to play?" Eve asked Klein, pointing at the card table after a brief introduction between the 2 parties. Klein didn't hesitate, immediately shaking his head to refuse. He had no interest in playing cards with zombies in the middle of the night. Eve nodded, placed her Southwell beer on the card table, pulled over 2 chairs, handed one to Klein, and said, "I'll play for a bit, you can watch with Sharon, or go play something else." Klein took the chair Eve handed him and sat beside Sharon. As he sat down, Klein subtly observed Sharon and Marich. Miss Sharon should know Eve's identity, but she didn't seem interested in probing his relationship with Eve. Not only that, Klein noticed that this lady's emotions seemed very restrained, just like a delicate doll detached from the world. As for Mr. Marich, Klein didn't know if he knew Eve's specific identity, but he also didn't seem interested in probing Klein's identity. However, compared to Sharon, he showed a bit more curiosity about Klein. And compared to Sharon, his emotions were much more outwardly expressed, although mostly dominated by malice. Klein suspected that Marich's malice might be related to his pathway, perhaps a characteristic of his pathway, possibly the devil or aberrant pathway. While Klein was deep in thought, many poker cards had already been dealt onto the table, and the game was progressing little by little. Eve won 2 rounds and lost 1 before stopping. She picked up her glass, stood up, and waved to Klein and Rui Rui, saying, "It should be ready now." Eve bent down and opened her handbag for Rui Rui, and the black cat's slender body immediately leapt nimbly into the bag. Sharon and Marich stood up and respectfully bid them farewell. A backland gathering. Klein followed Eve into a dark, deserted alley and stopped in front of a house. Eve took out a black iron mask and a hooded robe, handing them to Klein. The mask only covered the lower half of his face, but the robe was very loose, enveloping Klein entirely, so the only information it revealed was his height. Eve also took out a mask and a robe, putting them on. Only after seeing Klein ready did she reach out and knock on the wooden door rhythmically. A few seconds later, a small wooden block on the door was pulled open, revealing a pair of deep brown eyes. The eyes scanned the 2 of them, scrutinizing them. After 2 seconds, Klein saw the main door being opened from the inside. A tall man wearing a black iron mask stood inside the door, his gaze lingering on the 2 for a second before he silently turned half his body, making way for them to pass. As Klein stepped into the house, the man immediately closed the door and led them through the living room to the ground floor parlor. A candle was lit on the coffee table in the living room, the only light source in the room. The dim, flickering light was not enough to illuminate the entire room. 7 or 8 people sat on the sofas around the coffee table, all dressed in black iron masks and hooded robes. After a while, a few more people entered, bringing the total in the room to about a dozen, and then no one else came in. Eve casually found a quiet corner and sat down. Klein followed Eve without hesitation, sitting beside her. Klein did not speak rashly, quietly listening to the conversations of the gathering members and watching several transactions slowly complete. Among these transactions, there was nothing he needed. Whether it was potions or charms, he had better channels to acquire them, and there were no Beander potion formulas or materials he required. Compared to potions and charms, he hoped to obtain some mystical items. Unfortunately, no mystical item that satisfied him appeared at the moment. The only prosperity accessory that somewhat tempted him could not enhance his self-preservation ability, and its price was quite unattractive. Klein scanned the room and, during a brief silence, opened his mouth to propose his first transaction at this gathering. I need a mystical item, at least sequence 7 level. Sequence 7. The lady who had sold 2 mystical items frowned slightly, then pondered and said to Klein, I can provide one, but not now. If you are willing to trust me, we can make a deal. You pay half the deposit first, and I will bring the mystical item to the next gathering, then you pay the remaining balance. Cash only, the lady added, no checks. This lady must be an artisan or has an artisan behind her. Klein silently speculated in his mind, nodding to show understanding, and asked, how much is the deposit? He wasn't afraid of the lady defaulting. As a seer, he had many ways to find her. Furthermore, the organizer of this gathering would not allow it. If such a large and malicious transaction occurred at his gathering, it would inevitably plunge the gathering into a crisis of trust. In a place without official institutional constraints, mutual trust among members and the authority of those in power were often very important. While Klein was thinking, the lady selling the mystical item kept her gaze on Klein for a few seconds, seemingly pondering something, then she held up 2 fingers and said directly, 2,500. 2,500 pounds. That price was enough to buy a decent house in Backland. Klein's heart skipped a beat. Although he had guessed that a sequence 7 mystical item would definitely be expensive, even with mental preparation, he was still startled when the lady quoted the price. A deposit of 2,500 pounds meant the mystical item was priced at 5,000 pounds, that was how many years of his salary. No, Klein refused without hesitation, I cannot spend 5,000 pounds on a mystical item whose effect cannot be guaranteed. If its effect is not what I want or its negative impact is too great, then it's not worth that price. Can you find a mystical item that perfectly meets my requirements and has very little negative impact? What are your requirements? The lady continued to ask calmly, as if she had long anticipated this situation. If they are too high, then the price will have to increase further. Its appearance should be suitable for a young woman to carry, and its primary function should be to enhance combat power, but it's best if it can attack enemies without needing to be in close proximity. Klein stated his well-thought-out requirements one by one. Are there too many requirements? Klein felt a little uneasy after speaking, but his expression remained calm. The mask obscured the woman's face, so Klein couldn't see her expression, but he still watched intently. All right, the woman's voice came again after what seemed like a long time. 2,000 pounds, that's the bottom line. That means it can still go lower. Klein's lips under the mask curved slightly, and he opened his mouth to haggle. There was no other way, this price was indeed too high for Klein. All his assets were left in Tingen, and in the times since arriving in Backland, Klein hadn't hunted many pirates, so he couldn't even afford the deposit. After some debate, the transaction was finally completed with a 1,750-pound deposit. Klein took out all the cash he had brought, counted it in front of the woman, exactly 1,750 pounds, and handed it to her. The woman took the gold pounds and counted them again in front of Klein. Klein had only brought 1,300 pounds, it was clear whose the extra 450 pounds were. In debt again. Klein sighed slightly in his heart, feeling as if it hadn't been long since his last debt. Was he destined to go further and further down the path of debt and repayment in this life? Klein chuckled to himself, with a touch of humor. Another transaction was completed. Such a large transaction was exceptionally rare in this small gathering, which made some members unable to resist secretly looking at Klein, their expressions showing clear scrutiny and curiosity. However, this gradually quieting gathering did not become lively again because of the large transaction. After a few more transactions, the gathering came to an end. Old Mr. Eye of Wisdom clapped his hands and said to everyone, "That's enough for today. As per custom, leave one by one, with a 3-minute interval between each person. Leaving one by one, 3 minutes apart, probably to prevent someone from being followed or even robbed after leaving." Klein thought to himself, "You go first." The old man raised his chin, gesturing to Klein. As the member with the largest transaction amount this time, other members might risk ambushing Klein. Out of responsibility for the gathering members, Eye of Wisdom decided that Klein should leave first. Klein received the hint from Eye of Wisdom, nodded, and followed the attendant through the parlor to the main door, took off his mask and robe, and then, without lingering in the alley, returned to the Bravehearts bar by memory. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.